I've been led to share with you a story, The Hiding Place. It concerns World War II, the story of Corrie ten Boom and her family, the ten Booms, in Holland. During World War II, and actually a first-hand account of what took place in one family. In January, I was led to read this book again, because I believe that we are in the process, if we already are not in the beginning stages of World War III. I was led to read this book because there is a lot of direction with The Hiding Place. We can see the testimony of Jesus Christ and the power of Christ that worked through this family. I want to share the story with you in a way that it would help you be able to cope, be able to help, be able to stand in faith in this day of evil. We can look back on someone's life who lived during that time and see the fruit of their labor and the power of Christ working in them. I will begin with the introduction of the book. Please, if you'd like to take notes on some key things that the Lord speaks to your spirit about. Most of the people who lived during that time in World War II are not with us anymore. So we have a generation of people who know not much, if anything, about that war and the struggles and the things that took place, nor do they know about the power of Jesus Christ in that day. I had a dream recently where the Lord said in the dream, the Spirit of the Lord said, taking the key of faith and love in row 3, taking the key of faith and love into row 3. I now wonder if that's concerning World War III and the time that we live in. A complete new generation, especially in the U.S., who never saw, who have never seen a war-torn country, who have never really had the struggles that they did. So I'll begin with the introduction. This book is titled The Hiding Place. Corrie ten Boom with John and Elizabeth Sherrill. I hope that you take the story to heart and learn some things from it that will be able to carry you into row 3 with faith and love as they did. Introduction. April 1995 marks the 103rd anniversary of Corrie ten Boom's birth and the 12th anniversary of her rebirth in heaven. For this new edition of The Hiding Place, Elizabeth Sherrill reflects on what such milestones meant to her friend Corrie. How excited Corrie ten Boom would get about her birthdays, her own and everyone else's. To her, a birthday wasn't the completion of the year, but the beginning of a new one. A wonderful new year waited to be lived. How do you know that the next year's going to be wonderful? I asked her once. My own upcoming year with our oldest child leaving for college wasn't one I looked forward to. We were talking on a rainy afternoon in Holland, where I was doing research for The Hiding Place. That morning we visited the grim brick wall federal penitentiary at Schrevenwegen, where the memory of her birthday Corrie spent there had led to this discussion. She looked forward to each new year, Corrie answered, because of a phrase her father repeated whenever the family gathered for a birthday celebration. The best is yet to be. It was more than an expression of optimism, Corrie said. It was the summation of her father's faith. Whatever the current hardship, whatever the outward appearances, he knew that beneath those appearances God was in charge, bringing his kingdom to pass. And since that was true, better things than anyone could imagine were in the making. The best is yet to be, was the promise Father made us every birthday. From that day on, every time bad news threatens, I've thought of that birthday promise. The best is yet to be. Did that hold true in Corrie's life all the way to the end? Could Corrie's own birthdays illustrate the point? 3 of them come to mind at once. First, her birthday itself, April 15th, 1892. Corey was born above the watch shop in the narrow old house in Harlem where her father, before her, was born. It was his father who had placed the sign, 10 Boom Watches, in a ground floor window. On that windy April day, more than 100 years ago, it must have been hard for Corey's father to cling to his own credo, that the best still lay ahead. His wife, long a semi-invalid, had barely survived the death of this fifth child, and the doctor had confided to him that she would have no more. As for the tiny, sickly infant, the doctor only shook his head. Doubtless she would soon be another tiny headstone in the St. Baba cemetery, alongside the grave of the couple's third child. The rest of the family tried to console the sorrowing parents. Death for this baby would become a blessing. The newborn girl was obviously too frail to lead a normal life. One of the uncles picked the scrawny creature up in his arms. "Father," Hendrik prayed, "we ask you to take this little one swiftly to yourself." But Uncle Hendrik, of course, was judging by appearances. The best indeed was yet to be. For Corey lived to be 91, a guide and inspiration to millions all over the world. The second birthday, I think, I was the one in Srebrenica prison. In the old house above the watch shop, Corey had already celebrated 51 birthdays. Joyful events when the front room filled with guests and singing, but in 1944, Holland had just been occupied by Nazi Germany for 4 years, and Corey had turned the old house above the shop into a way station for Jews fleeing the Holocaust. In February 1944, the Gestapo caught up with them. Corey, her sister Betsy, and their godly 84-year-old father were taken to Srebrenica, where Corey was placed in solitary confinement. Since childhood, Corey's most tormenting fear had been of being alone. Now she was alone indeed, sick with the flu, forbidden to speak to the only two human beings she saw, the guard who showed her daily hunk of dry bread through a slot in the door, and a doctor, a shaved-headed fellow prisoner who every few days was admitted to record her pulse and temperature. Somehow, alone and ill, it seemed all the more important to Corey not to let her birthday come and go unmarked. With a stay tugged from her corset, she scratched a crude calendar on the wall behind her straw-covered cot. One by one, she crossed off the lonely days. February, March, and now was April 15th. A birthday had to mean a celebration. If there were no guests, at least she could have a song. In a voice raspy with fever, Corey began to sing about the tree in the center of Harlem, which bloomed each April, a song she and Betsy had always sung on her birthday. "Silence in there!" blows hammered on her iron door. Bleakly, Corey lay back on the sour straw. No song either, then. Perhaps it was just as well. Thoughts of the happy past always threatened to bring on tears, but thinking of the present, she quickly discovered, was worse. What could she think about on this 52nd birthday then? The future. Her father's yearly promise. The best is yet to be. Could she still believe that, here alone, with the future seemingly in the hands of men bent on destroying all that was fine and true? What proof did she have that anything good lay in the future? What tiny hint gave her any excuse to hope? The jangle of the keys sounded in the corridor. The cell door clanged open, and the inmate doctor shuffled in for his wordless examination. Behind his shaven head loomed the rigid form of the guard. Still, as the doctor bent to feel her pulse, Corey risked a just audible whisper. "Today is my birthday." In the dim cell, the doctor's hand groped for her wrist. Instead of stopping there, however, she felt his fingers clasp her own. Then, with the movement so slight, no switch of his arm betrayed it, and he shook her hand. It was enough. Into her solitary world a caring gesture had come. In a place where hatred seemed triumphant had come a sign that love still lived, a promise that God was still working out his best. Corey spent the rest of her life living out that promise. Neither father nor Betsy survived imprisonment. Corey alone returned to Harlem to cope with her own loss by ministering to war-shadowed lives, first in Holland, then among the former enemy in Germany itself. Each time a need was met, another more challenging one opened up until the world became Corey's field of service, traveling, writing, and speaking. On the third birthday I'm thinking of here, however, Corey was in prison once again. The prison, this time, was a paralyzed body. She was in her mid-80s when she suffered her first stroke. Subsequent ones stripped this energetic person one by one of her faculties, speech, mobility, finally even the ability to feed or do anything all for herself. With her companion, Pam Rosewell, Corey was able to remain in the small home friends had provided for her in California. And to that home, since she could no longer come to them, came people from around the world. We came to cheer and comfort Corey in her weakness. We went away, cheered and comforted by her. It was the last surprise of this surprising life, how in total silence Corey was able to communicate the love of God, without speaking, often even without opening her eyes. She radiated such acceptance of her situation, such trust in this ultimate victory, that we could leave her green and white room not speaking of the happier past, but eager for the still better future. John and I no longer telephone Corey on her birthdays. We don't speak Dutch, and following English had become a strain for her. But we'd say an extra prayer on April 15th, always repeating her father's assurance that the best was still ahead. That's why we weren't at all surprised when Pam phoned us on April 16th, 1983, to tell us about Corey's 91st birthday celebration. Corey had been semi-comatose all day, Pam said, seemingly unaware of the cards and flowers filling the room. Pam and the other helpers in the house sang as much as their Dutch would allow of her favorite hymns, and Corey opened her eyes long enough to show that she had heard. She died just before 11, Pam said, so simply, on her birthday, like a child going home to the best that had been waiting for her all along, to the happiest birthday celebration of them all, home with her father and Betsy, where the trees are all in bloom, and no one can stop the singing ever again. Elizabeth Sherrill, Chappaqua, New York, April 1995. And now I will share with you Chapter 1, The 100th Birthday Party. I jumped out of bed that morning with one question in mind: sun or fog? Usually it was fog in January in Holland, dank, chill, and gray. But occasionally, on a rare and magic day, a winter sun broke through. A white winter sun broke through. I leaned as far as I could from the single window in my bedroom. It was always hard to see the sky from the Vigie. Blank brick walls looked at me. Blank brick walls looked back at me, the backs of other ancient buildings in this crowded center of old Harlem. But up there where my neck craned to see, above the crazy roofs and crooked chimneys, was a square of pale pearl sky. It was going to be a sunny day for the party. I attempted a little waltz as I took my new dress from the tipsy old wardrobe against the wall. Father's bedroom is directly under mine, but at 77 he slept soundly. That was one advantage to growing old, I thought, as I worked my arms into the sleeves and surveyed the effect in the mirror on the wardrobe door. Although some Dutch women in 1937 were wearing their skirts knee-length, mine was still a cautious 3 inches above my shoes. You're not growing younger yourself, I reminded my reflection. Maybe it was the new dress that made me look more critically at myself than usual. 45 years old, unmarried, waistline long since vanished. My sister Betsy, though 7 years older than I, still had that slender grace that made people turn and look after her in the street. Heaven knows it wasn't her clothes. Our little watch shop had never made much money. But when Betsy put on a dress, something wonderful happened to it. All on me until Betsy caught up with them. Hems sagged, stockings tore, and collars twisted. But today, I thought, standing back from the mirror as far as I could in the small room, the effect of dark maroon was very smart. Far below me down the street, the doorbell rang. Callers? Before 7 in the morning? I opened my bedroom door and plunged down the steep, twisting stairway. These stairs were an afterthought in this curious old house. Actually, it was 2 houses. The one in front was a typical tiny old Harlem structure, 3 stories high, 2 rooms deep, and only 1 room wide. At some unknown point in its long history, its rear walls had been knocked through to join it with the even thinner, steeper house in the back of it, which had only 3 rooms, one on top of the other, and this narrow corkscrew staircase squeezed between the 2. Quick as I was, Betsy was at the door ahead of me. An enormous spray of flowers filled the doorway. As Betsy took them in, a small delivery boy appeared. "Nice day for the party, miss," he said, trying to peer past the flowers as though the coffee and cake might already be set out. He would be coming to the party later, as indeed, it seemed, would all of Harlem. Betsy and I searched the bouquet for the card. "Pickwick!" we shouted together. Pickwick was an enormously wealthy customer who not only bought the very finest watches but often came upstairs to the family part of the house above the shop. His real name was Herman Slewring. Pickwick was a name Betsy and I used between ourselves because he looked so incredibly like the illustrator's drawing in our copy of Dickens. Herman Slewring was without the doubt the ugliest man in Harlem. Short, immensely fat, head bald as the Holland cheese. He was so walled-eyed that you were never quite sure whether he was looking at you or someone else, and as kind and generous as he was fearsome to look at. The flowers had come to the side door, the door the family used, opening into a tiny alleyway, and Betsy and I carried them from the little hall into the shop. First was the workman, where watches and clocks were repaired. There was the high bench over which Father had bent for so many years doing the delicate, painstaking work that was known as the finest in Holland. And there in the center of the room was my bench, and next to mine, Hans the apprentice's, and against the wall, old Christophel's. Beyond the workroom was the customer's part of the shop, within its glass case full of watches. All the wall clocks were striking 7 o'clock as Betsy and I carried the flowers in and looked for the more artistic spot to put them. Ever since childhood, I had loved to step into this room where 100 tinkling voices welcomed me. It was still dark inside because the shutters had not been drawn back from the windows on the street. I unlocked the street door and stepped into the Barcellostraat. The other shops up and down the narrow street were shuttered and silent. The opticians next door, the dress shop, the bakers, Wells Furers across the street. I folded back our shutters and stood for a minute admiring the window display that Betsy and I had just last agreed upon. This window was always a great source of debate between us. I wanted to display as much of our stock as could be squeezed into the shelf, but Betsy, maintaining that 2 or 3 beautiful watches with perhaps a piece of silk or satin swirled beneath was more elegant and more inviting. But this time the window satisfied us both. It held a collection of clocks and pocket watches, all at least 100 years old, borrowed for the occasion from friends and antique dealers all over the city. For today was the shop's 100th birthday. It was on this day in January 1837 that Father's father had placed this in the window, a sign, "Ten Boom Watches." For the last 10 minutes, with a heavenly disregard for the precisions of passing time, the church bells of Harlem had been pealing out 7 o'clock, and now half a block away, in the town square, the great bell of St. Balbo's solemnly donged seven times. I lingered in the street to count them, though it was cold in the January dawn. Of course, everyone in Harlem had radios now, but I could remember when the life of the city had run on St. Bavo time, and the only trainmen and others who needed to know the exact hour had come here to read the astronomical clock. Father would take the train to Amsterdam each week to bring back the time from the Naval Observatory, and it was a source of pride to him that the astronomical clock was never more than 2 seconds off in the 7 days. There it stood now as I stepped back into the shop, still tall and gleaming in its concrete block, but shorn now of eminence. The doorbell on the alley was ringing again. More flowers. So it went on for an hour, large bouquets and small ones, elaborate set pieces and homegrown plants in clay pots. For although the party was for the shop, the affection of the city was for Father. Harlem's grand old man, they called him. And they were setting about to prove it. When the shop and the workmen would not hold another bouquet, Betsy and I started carrying them upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop. Though it was 20 years since her death, there were still Tante Jane's rooms. They were still known as Tante Jane's rooms. Tante Jane's was Mother's older sister, and her presence lingered in the massive dark furniture she had left behind her. Betsy set down a pot of greenhouse-grown tulips and stepped back with a little cry of pleasure. "Corey, just look how much brighter." Poor Betsy. The Bajie was so closed in by houses around that the window plants she started each spring never grew tall enough to bloom. At 7:45, Hans, the apprentice, arrived, and at 8 o'clock, Tews, our saleslady bookkeeper. Tews was a sour-faced, scowling individual whose ill temper had made it impossible for her to keep a job until 10 years ago. She had come to work for Father. Father's gentle courtesy had disarmed and mellowed her, and though she would have died sooner than admit it, she loved him as fiercely as she disliked the rest of the world. We left Hans and Tews to answer the doorbell and went upstairs to get breakfast. Only 3 places at the table, I thought, as I set out the plates. The dining room was in the house at the rear, 5 steps higher than the shop but lower than Tan Boom's rooms. To me, this room, with its single window looking into the alley, was the heart of the home. This table, with a blanket thrown over it, had made me a tent or a pirate's cove when I was small. I'd done my homework here as a schoolchild. Here Mama read aloud from the Dickens on winter evenings. Here Mama read aloud from Dickens on winter evenings while the coal whistled in the brick hearth and cast a red glow on the tile, proclaiming, "Jesus is victor." We used only a corner of the table now, Father, Betsy, and I, but to me the rest of the family was always there. There was Mama's chair, and the 3 aunts' places over there. Not only Tante Jane's, but Mama's other 2 sisters who had also lived with us. Next to me sat my other sister, Nolly, and Willem, the only boy in the family, there beside Father. Nolly and Willem had homes of their own many years now, and Mama and the aunts were dead. But still I seemed to see them there. Of course their chairs hadn't stayed empty long. Father could never bear a house without children, and whenever he heard of a child in need of a home, a new face would appear at the table. Somehow, out of his watch shop that never made money, he fed and dressed and cared for 11 more children after his own 4 were grown. But now these 2 had grown up and married or gone off to work, and so I laid 3 plates on the table. Betsy brought the coffee in from the tiny kitchen, which was little more than a closet off the dining room, and soon bread from the drawer in the sideboard. She was setting them on the table when we heard Father's steps coming down the staircase. He went a little slowly now on the winding stairs, but still as punctual as one of his own watches. He entered the dining room, as he had every morning since I could remember, at 8:10. "Father," I said, kissing him and savoring the aroma of cigars that had always clung to his long beard. "A sunny day for a party." Father's hair and beard were now as white as the best tablecloth Betsy had laid for this special day, but his blue eyes behind the thick, round spectacles were as mild and merry as ever, and he gazed from one of us to the other with frank delight. "Corey, dear, my dear Betsy, How gay and lovely you both look." He bowed his head as he sat down and said blessing over the bread, and then went on eagerly, "Your mother, how she would have loved these new styles and seeing you both looking so pretty." Betsy and I looked hard into our coffee to keep from laughing. These new styles were the despair of our young nieces, who were always trying to get us into brighter colors, shorter skirts, and lower necklines. But conservative though as we were, it was true that Mama had never had anything as bright as my deep maroon dress or Betsy's dark blue one. In Mama's day, married women and unmarried women of certain age wore black from the chin to the ground. I had never seen Mama or the aunts in any other color. "How Mama would have loved everything about today," Betsy said. "Remember how she loved occasions? Mama could have coffee on the stove and cake in the oven as fast as most people could say best wishes. And since she knew almost everyone in Harlem, especially the poor, sick, and neglected, there was almost no day in the year that was not for somebody, and she would say with eyes shining, 'A very special occasion.'" And so we sat over our coffee, as one should on anniversaries, and looked back at the time when Mama was alive and beyond, back to the time when Father was a small boy growing up in this same house. "I was born right in this room," he said, as though he has not told us 100 times. Only, of course, it wasn't the dining room then, but a bedroom. And the bed was in a kind of cupboard set into the wall with no windows and no light or air of any kind. It was the first baby who lived. I don't know how many there were before me, but they all died. Mother had tuberculosis, you see, and they didn't know about contaminated air or keeping babies away from sick people. It was a day for memories, a day for calling up the past. How could we ever have guessed as we sat here, two middle-aged sisters and an old man, that in a place of memories we were about to be given adventure such as we had never dreamed of. Adventure and anguish, horror and heaven were just around the corner, and we did not know. Oh, Father, Betsy, if I had known, would I have gone ahead? Could I have done things? Could I have done the things I did? But how could I know? How could I imagine this white-haired man called Opa, grandfather? But all the children of Harlem, how could I imagine this man thrown by strangers into a grave without a name? And Betsy, with her high-laced collar and her gift for making beauty all around her, how could I picture this dearest person on earth to me standing naked before a room full of men? In that room on that day, such thoughts were not even thinkable. Father stood up, the big brass-hinged Bible he received from its shelf, as Tooze and Hans rapped on the door and came in. Scripture reading at 8:30 each morning for all who were in the house was another one of the fixed points around which life in the Beijing revolved. Father opened the big volume, and Betsy and I held our breaths. Surely, today of all days, when there was still so much to do, it would not be a whole chapter. But he was turning to the Gospel of Luke, where we had left off yesterday. Such a long chapters in Luke, too. With his finger at the place, Father looked up. "Where is Christophels?" he said. Christophels was the third and only other employee in the shop, a bent, wizened little man who looked older than Father, though actually he was 10 years younger. I remembered the day 6 or 7 years earlier. When he had first come into the shop, so ragged and woebegone that I assumed he was one of the beggars who had the Beijing marked as a sure meal. I was about to send him up to the kitchen where Betsy kept a pot of soup simmering, when he announced with great dignity that he was considering permanent employee and was offering his service first to us. It turned out that Christophels belonged to an almost vanished trade. The itinerant clock-mender who trudged on foot throughout the land, regulating and repairing the tall pendulum clocks that were the pride of every Dutch farmhouse. But if I was surprised At the grand manner of this shabby little man, I was even more astonished when Father hired him on the spot. They're the finest clockmen anywhere, he told me later, these wandering clocksmiths. There's not a repair shop they haven't handled with just the tools in their sack. And it was so proved through the years as people from all over Harlem brought their clocks to him. What he did with his wages we never knew. He had remained as tattered and threadbare as ever. Father hinted as much as he dared, for next to his shabbiness, Christopher's most notable quality was his pride, and then gave it up. And now, for the first time ever, Christopher's was late. Father polished his glasses with his napkin and started to read, his deep voice lingering lovingly over the words. He had reached the bottom of the page when we heard Christopher shuffling the steps on the stairs. The door opened and all of us gasped. Christopher's was resplendent in a new black suit, new checkered vest, a snowy white shirt, a flowered tie, and stiff starched collar. I tore my eyes from the spectacle as swiftly as I could, for Christopher's expression forbade us to notice anything out of the ordinary. Christopher's, my dear associate, Father murmured in his formal, old-fashioned way, what joy to see you this auspicious day. And hastily he resumed his Bible reading. Before he reached the end of the chapter, the doorbells were ringing, both the shop bells on the street and the family bell in the alley. Betsy ran to make more coffee and put her tarties in the oven, while Tews and I hurried to the doors. It seemed that everyone in Harlem wanted to be the first to shake Father's hand. Before long, a steady stream of guests was winding up the narrow staircase to Tonty Jan's rooms, where he sat almost lost in a thick of flowers. I was helping one of the older guests up the steep stairs when Betsy seized my arm. Corey, we're going to need Nolly's cups right away. How can we? I'll go get them. Our sister Nolly and her husband were coming from the afternoon as soon as their 6 children got home from school. I dashed down the stairs, took my coat and my bicycle from inside the alley door, and was wheeling it over the threshold when Betsy's voice reached me, soft but firm. Corey, your new dress. So I whirled back up the stairs to my room, changed into my oldest skirt, and set out over the bumpy back streets, brick streets. I always loved to bike to Nolly's house. She and her husband lived about 1.5 miles from the Beijing, outside the cramped old center of the city. The streets were broader and straighter. Even the sky seemed bigger. Across the town square I pedaled, over the canal of the Grote Hoot Bridge and along the Wagenweg, revealing the thin winter sunshine. Nolly lived on the Bosenhovenstraat, a block of identical attached houses with the white curtains and potted plants in the windows. How could I foresee, as I zipped around the corner that one summer day, when the hyacinths and the commercial bulb flats nearby were ripe and brown? How could I break my bicycle here and stand with my heart thudding in my throat, daring to go no closer for fear what was taking place behind Nolly's starched curtains? Today I careened into the sidewalk and burst through the door with never a knock. Nolly, the Beijing's jammed already. You ought to see. We need the cups right now. Nolly came out of the kitchen, her round, pretty face flushed with baking. They're all packed by the door. Oh, I wish I could go back with you, but I've got batches of cookies still to bake, and I promised Flip and the children I'd wait for them. You're all coming, aren't you? Yes, Corey. Peter will be there. Nolly was loading the cups into the bicycle bags, and a dutiful aunt, as a dutiful aunt, I tried to love all my nieces and nephews equally, but Peter, well, Peter was Peter. At 13, he was a musical prodigy, and a rascal, and the pride of my life. He's even written a special song in honor of the day, Nolly said. Here now, you'll have to carry this bag full in your hands, so be careful. The Beijing was more crowded than ever when I got back. The alley was so jammed with bicycles, I had to leave mine at the corner. The mayor of Harlem was there, with his tailcoat and gold watch chain, and the postman and the trolley motorman, and 6 policemen from Harlem Police Headquarters just around the corner. After lunch, the children started coming in. As children always did, they went straight to Father. The older ones sat on the floor around him, and the smallest ones climbed into his lap. For in addition to his twinkling eyes and long cigar-sweet beard, Father ticked. watches lying on a shelf run differently from watches carried about, and so father always wore the ones he was regulating. His suit jackets had 4 huge inside pockets which fitted with hooks for dozens of watches, so that wherever he went, the hums of hundreds of little wheels went gaily with him. Now, with a child on each knee and 10 more crowded close, he drew from another pocket his heavy cross-shaped winding key, each of the 4 ends shaped for a different size clock. With a flick of his finger, he made it spin, gleaming, glinting. Betsy stopped in the door with a tray of cakes. "He doesn't know there's anyone else in the room," she said. I was carrying a stack of soiled plates down the stairs when a little shriek below me told me that Pickwick had arrived. We used to forget. We who loved him, that a shock of the first sight of him would be to a stranger. I hurried down to the door, introduced him hastily to the wife of an Amsterdam wholesaler, and got him upstairs. He sank his ponderous bulk into a chair beside father, fixed one eye on me and the other on the ceiling, and said, "5 lumps, please." Poor Pickwick. He loved children as much as father did, but while children took to father on sight, Pickwick had to win them. He had one trick, though that never failed. I brought him his cup of coffee, thick with sugar, and watched him look around in mock consternation. "But my dear Cornelia," he cried, "there's no table to set it on." He glanced out of one eye, wide-set eye, to make sure the children were watching. "Well, it's a lucky thing I brought my own." And with that, he set a cup and saucer on his protruding paunch. I had never known a child who could resist it, soon as a respectful circle had gathered round him. A little later, Nolly and her family arrived. "Tante Corey," Peter greeted me innocently. "You don't look 100 years old." And before I could swat him, he was sitting at Tonty John's upright piano, filling the whole house with melody. People called out requests, popular songs, selections from Bach chorales, hymns, and soon the whole room was joining in the choruses. How many of us were there that happy afternoon, who were soon to meet under very different circumstances. Peter, the policeman, dear ugly Pickwick, all of us were there except my brother Willem and his family. I wondered why they should be so late. Willem and his wife and children lived in the town of Hilversum, 30 miles away. Still, they should have been here by now. Suddenly the music stopped, and Peter, from his perch on the piano, hissed across the room, "Opa! Here's the competition." I glanced out the window, turning into the alley where Mr. and Mrs. Cann, owners of the other watch shop on the street. By Harlem standards, they were newcomers, having opened their store only in 1910, and so had been on Bartelsjoretstraat a mere 27 years. But since they sold a good many more watches than we did, I considered Peter's comment factual enough. Father, however, was distressed. "Not competitors, Peter," he said reprovingly, "colleagues." And lifting children quickly off his knees, he got up and hurried to the head of the stairs to greet the Kahns. Father treated Mr. Kahn frequent visits to the shop below with social calls from a cherished friend. Can you see what he's doing?" I would rage after Mr. Kahn had gone. "He's finding out how much we're charging so he can undersell us." Mr. Kahn's display window always featured in bold figures prices exactly 5 guilders below our own. And Father's face would light up with a kind of pleasure surprise, as it always did on those rare occasions when he thought about the business side of watchmaking. "But Corey, people will save money when they buy from him." And then he would always add, "I wonder how he does it." Father was as innocent of business know-how as his father had been before him. He would work for days on a difficult repair problem and then forget to send a bill. The more rare and expensive a watch, the less he was able to think of it in terms of money. A man should pay for the privilege of working on such a watch, he would say. As for merchandising methods, for the first 80 years of the shop's history, the shutters on the streets had been closed each evening promptly at 6 p.m. It was not until I myself had come into the business 20 years ago that I had noticed the throngs of strollers crowding the narrow sidewalks each evening, and had seen how the other stores kept their windows lighted and opened. When I pointed this out to Father, he was delighted as though I had made a profound discovery, and if people see the watches, it might make them want to buy one. Corey, my dear, how very clever you are. Mr. Kahn was making his way toward me now, full of cake and compliments. Guilty for the jealous thoughts I harbored, I took advantage of the crowd and made my escape downstairs. The workmen in shop were even more crowded and well-wishers than the upstairs rooms. Hans was passing cakes in the back room, as was Tooze in the front, wearing the nearest thing to a smile that her perpetually drawn lips would permit. As far as Christopher's, he had simply and astonishingly expanded. It was impossible to recognize that stooped and shabby little man in the glorious figure at the door, greeting newcomers with a formal welcome, followed by a relentless tour of the shop. Quite obviously, it was the greatest day of his life. As though the short winter afternoon they kept coming, the people who had counted themselves Father's friends, young and old, poor and rich, scholarly gentlemen and illiterate servant girls, only to Father did it seem they were all alike. That was Father's secret. Not that he overlooked the differences in people, that he didn't know they were there. And still Willem was not there. I said goodbye to some guests at the door and stood for a moment gazing up and down the Barteljoestraat. Although it was only 4 in the afternoon, the lights in the shops were coming on against the January dusk. I still had a great deal of little sister worship for this big brother, 5 years older than I, and an ordained minister, and only Ten Boom, the only Ten Boom who had ever been to college. Willem saw things, I felt. He knew what was going on in the world. Oftentimes, indeed, I wished that Willem did not see quite so well, for as much as he saw was frightening. A full 10 years ago, back in 1927, Willem had written his doctoral thesis, done in Germany, that a terrible evil was taking root in that land. Right at the university, he says seeds were being planted of a contempt for human life, such as the world had never seen. The few who had read his paper had laughed. Now, of course, well, people were laughing about Germany. Most of the good clocks came from there, and recently several firms with whom we had dealt with for years were simply and mysteriously out of business. Willem believed it was part of the deliberate and large-scale move against the Jews. Every one of the closed business was Jewish. As the head of the Dutch Reformed Church's program to reach Jews, William kept in touch with these things. Dear Willem, I thought, as I stepped back inside and closed the door. He was about as good a salesman of the church as Father was of watches. If he had converted a single Jew in 20 years, I hadn't heard about it. Willem didn't try to change people just to serve them. He had scrimped and saved enough money to build a home for elderly Jews in Hilversum. For the elderly of all faiths, in fact, for William was against any system of segregation. But in the last few months, the home had been deluged with younger arrivals, all Jews, and all from Germany. William and his family had given up their own living quarters and were sleeping in the corridor. And still the frightened homeless people kept coming, and with them tales of a mounting madness. I went up to the kitchen where Nolly had just brewed a pot of coffee, picked it up, and continued with it upstairs to Tonty John's rooms. "What does he want?" I asked a group of men gathered around the cake table as I sat down the pot. "This man in Germany, does he want war?" I knew it was poor talk for a party, but somehow thoughts of Willem always set my mind on hard subjects. A chill of silence fell over the table, and I spread swiftly around the room. "What does it matter?" A voice broke into it. "Let the big countries fight it out. It won't affect us." "That's right," from a watchman salesman. "The Germans let us alone in the Great War. It's to their advantage to keep us neutral." "Easy for you to talk," cried a man from whom he bought clock parch. Your stock comes from Switzerland. What about us? What do I do if Germany goes to war? A war could put me out of business." And at that moment Willem entered the room. Behind him was Tine, his wife, and their 4 children. But every eye in the room had settled on the figure whose arm Willem held in his. It was a Jew in his early 30s, in the typical broad-brimmed black hat and long black coat. What glued everyone to this man was his face. It had been burned. In front of his right ear dangled a gray and frizzled ringlet, like the hair of a very old man. The rest of his beard was gone, leaving only a raw and gaping wound. "This is Herr Gutenberg," Willem announced in German. "He just arrived in Hilversum this morning. Herr Gutenberg, my father." He got out of Germany on a milk truck, Willem told rapidly in Dutch. They stopped him on a street corner, teenage boys in Munich, and set fire to his beard. Father had risen from his chair and eagerly shaking the newcomer's hand. I bought him a cup of coffee and a plate of Nolly's cookies. How grateful I was now for Father's insistence that his children speak German and English almost as soon as Dutch. Herr Gutenberg sat stiffly on the edge of the chair and fixed his eyes on the cup in his lap. I pulled up a chair beside him and talked some nonsense about the usual January weather, and around us conversation began again, a hum of party talking rising and falling. "Hoodlums," I heard the watch salesman say. "Young hoodlums. It's the same in every country. The police'll catch up with them, you'll see. Germany's a civilized country." And so the shadow fell across us that winter afternoon in 1937, but it rested lightly. Nobody dreamed that this tiny cloud would grow until it blocked out the sky, and no one dreamed that in this darkness each of us would be called to play a role. Father and Betsy and Mr. Kahn and Willem, even the funny old Beijing and its unmatching floor levels and ancient angles. In the evening after the last guest had gone, I climbed the stairs to my room, thinking only of the past. On my bed lay a new maroon dress. I had forgotten to put it back on. I never did care about clothes, I thought, even when I was young. Childhood scenes rushed back to me out of the night, strangely close and urgent. Today I know that such memories are the key of not to the past but to the future. I know that the experiences of our lives, when we let God use them, become the mysterious and perfect preparation for the work He will give us to do. I didn't know it then, nor indeed that there was any new future to prepare for in a life as humdrum and predictable as mine. I only knew as I lay in my bed at the top of the house that certain moments from long ago stood out in focus against the blurs of years. Oddly sharp and near they were, as though they were not yet finished, as though they had something more to say. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is Full Table. It was 1898, and I was 6 years old. Betsy stood me in front of the wardrobe mirror and gave me a lecture. "Just look at your shoes. You missed every other button, and those old torn stockings your very first day at school. See how nice Nolly looks?" Nolly and I shared this bedroom at the top of the Beijing. I looked at my 8-year-old sister. Sure enough, her high-buttoned shoes were neatly fastened. Reluctantly, I pulled off mine while Betsy rummaged in the wardrobe. At 13, Betsy seemed almost like an adult to me. Of course, Betsy had always seemed older because she couldn't run and roughhouse the other way the other children did. Betsy had been born with pernicious anemia, and so while the rest of us played tag or bowled the hoop or had skate races down frozen canals in winter, Betsy sat and did dull grown-up things like embroidery. But Nolly played as hard as anyone and wasn't much older than I, and it didn't seem fair that she should always do everything right. "Betsy," she said earnestly, "I'm not going to wear that great ugly hat to school just because Tanty Jane's paid for it. Last year it was that ugly gray one, and this year it's even worse." Betsy looked at her sympathetically. "Well, but you can't go to school without a hat, and you know we can afford another one." "We don't have to." With an anxious glance at the door, Nolly dropped to her knees, reached beneath the single bed, which was all our tiny room would hold, and drew out a little round hat box. Inside nestled the smallest hat I had ever seen. It was a fur with a blue satin ribbon for under the chin. "Oh, the darling thing!" Betsy lifted up reverently from the box and held it up to the patch of light that struggled into the room over the surrounding rooftops. "Where did you ever?" "Mrs. Van Diver gave it to me. The Van Divers owned the millinery shop 2 doors down." She saw me looking at it, and later, She brought it here, after Tanny James picked out that. Nolly pointed to the top of the wardrobe. A deep-rimmed brown bonnet with a cluster of lavender velvet roses proclaimed in every line of the personage who had picked it out. Tanty James, Mama's older sister, had moved in with us when her husband died, to spend, as she put it, what few days remained to me, though she was still only in her early 40s. Her coming had greatly complicated life in the old house, already crowded by the early arrivals of Mama's other two sisters, Tanty Bep and Tanty Anna, since along with Tanty Jans had come quantities of furniture, all of it too large for the little rooms at the Beijing. For her own use, Tanty Jans took the 2 second-story rooms of the front house directly over the watch shop and workroom. In the first room, she wrote the flaming Christian tracts for which she was known all over Holland, and in the second received the well-to-do ladies who supported this work. Tanty James believed that our welfare in the hereinafter depended on how much we could accomplish here on earth. For sleep, she partitioned off a cubicle from her writing room, just large enough to hold a bed. Death, she often said, was waiting to snatch her from her work, and so she kept her hours of repose as brief and businesslike as possible. I could not remember life in the Beijing before Tanty John's arrival, nor whose these 2 rooms had been before. Above them was a narrow attic beneath the steep, sloping roof of the first house. For as long as I could recall, this space had been divided into 4 truly miniature rooms. The first one, looking out over the Barthologerstraat, and the only one with the real window, was Tanty John Bep's. Behind it, strung like railroad compartments off a narrow aisle, were Tanty Anna's, Betsy's, and our brother Willem's. 5 steps up from those rooms in the second house behind was Nolly's and my small room. Beneath our Mama's and Father's room, beneath theirs the dining room with the kitchen, tacked like an afterthought to the side of it. If Tanty Jan's share in this crowded house was remarkably large, it never seemed to any of us living there. The world just naturally made place for Tanty John's. All day long the horse-drawn trolley clopped and clanked past our house to stop at the Groat Market, the central town square half a block away. At least, that was where it stopped for other people. When Tanty John's wished to go somewhere, she stationed herself on the sidewalk directly in front of the watch shop door, and as the horses thundered close, held up a single glove finger. It looked to me more possible to stop the sun in the sky than to halt the charge of that trolley before its appointed place, but it stopped for Tanty John's. Brakes squealing, horses nearly falling over one another, and the driver tipped his tall hat as she swept aboard. And this was the commanding eye past which Nolly had to get that little fur hat. Tanty Jan's had bought most of the clothing for us 3 girls since coming to live with us, but her gifts had a price. To Tanty John's, the clothes and fashion when she was young represented God's final say on human apparel. All change since then came from the style book of the devil. Indeed, one of her best-known pamphlets exposed him as the inventor of the mutton sleeve and the bicycle shirt. I know, I said now as the button hook in Betsy's swift fingers sped up my shoes. You could fit that fur hat right inside the bonnet. Then when you get outside, take the bonnet off. Corey, Nolly was genuinely shocked. That wouldn't be honest. And with a baleful glance at the big brown hat she picked up, the little fur one, and started after Betsy down the stairs to breakfast. I picked up my own hat, the despised gray one from last year, and trailed after them, one hand clinging to the center post. Let Tanty John see that silly hat then. I didn't care. I never could understand all the fuss over clothes. What did I understand? What I did understand was an awful and alarming, and that was the day I was to start school. To leave this old house above the watch shop, leave Mama and Father and the aunts, in fact, leave behind everything that was certain and well-loved. I gripped the post so tight that my palm squeaked as I circled around. The elementary school was only a block and a half away, it was true, and Nolly had gone there 2 years without difficulty. But Nolly was different from me. She was pretty and well-behaved, and always had her handkerchief. And then, as I rounded the final curve, the solution came to me. So clear and simple that I laughed out loud. I just wouldn't go to school. I'd stay here and help Tantiana with the cooking, and Mama would teach me to read, and I'll never go into that strange, ugly building at all. Relief and comfort flooded me as I took the last 3 steps in a bound. Shh! Betsy and Nolly were waiting for me outside the dining room door. For heaven's sake, Corey, don't do anything to get Tonty John started wrong, Betsy said. I'm sure, she added doubtfully, that Father and Mama and Tantiana will like Nolly's hat. Tonty Bet won't, I said. She never likes anything, Nolly said, so she doesn't count. Tonty Bet, with her perpetual disapproving scowl, was the oldest of the aunts, and the one we children liked least. For 30 years she had worked as a governess with wealthy families, and they continually compared our behavior with that of the young ladies and gentlemen she was used to. Betsy pointed to the Frisian clock on the stairwell, and with a finger on her lips silently opening the dining room door. It was 8:12. Breakfast had already begun. 2 minutes late, cried Willem triumphantly. The Waller children were never late, said Tonty Bet. But they're here, said Father, and the room is brighter. The 3 of us hardly heard. Tonty John's chair was empty. If Tonty John's staying in bed today? Asked Betsy hopefully as we hung our hats on their pegs. She's making herself a tonic in the kitchen, said Mama. She leaned forward to pour our coffee and lowered her voice. We must all be specially considerate of dear Tonty John's today. This is the day her husband's sister died some years ago. Or was it his cousin? I thought it was his aunt, said Tantiana. It was a cousin, and it was a mercy, said Tonty Bet. At any rate, Mama hurried on, you know how these anniversaries upset dear John's, so we must all try to make it up to her. Betsy cut 3 slices from the round loaf of bread while I looked around the table to decide which adult would be more enthusiastic about my intentions to stay home. Father, I knew, put an almost religious importance on education. He himself had to stop school early to go to work in the watch shop, and though he had gone on to teach history himself, theology and literature in 5 languages, he always regretted the missed schooling. He would want me to go, and whatever Father wanted, Mama wanted too. Tantiana, then. She often told me she wouldn't manage without me to run errands up and down the steep stairs. Since Mama was not strong, Tantiana did most of the heavy housework for the family of 9. She was the youngest of the 4 sisters, with a spirit as generous as Mama's own. There was a myth in our family, firmly believed in by all, that Tantiana received wages for this work, and indeed every Saturday Father faithfully paid her 1 guilder. But by Wednesday, when the greengrocer came, he had often had to ask for it back, and she always had it, unspent and waiting. Yes, she would be my ally in this business. Tantiana, I began, I've been thinking about you working so hard all day when I'm in school, and a deep, dramatic intake of breath made us all look up. Tonty John's was standing in the kitchen doorway, a tumbler of thick brown liquid in her hand. When she had filled her chest with air, closed her eyes, lifted the glass to her lip, and drained it down. Then, with a sigh, she let out a breath, set the glass on the sideboard, and sat down. And yet, she said, as though we had been discussing the subject, what do doctors know? Dr. Blinkler prescribed this tonic, but what can medicine really do? What does anything do when one's day arrives? I glanced around the table. No one was smiling. Tonty John's preoccupation with death might be funny, but it wasn't. Young as I was, I knew that fear is never funny. And yet Jans, Father remonstrated gently. Medicine has prolonged many a life. It didn't help Zuzi, and she had the finest doctors in Rottingham. It was this very day when she was taken, and she was no older than I am now, and got up and dressed for breakfast that day, just as I have. She was launching into a minute-by-minute account of Zuzi's final day when her eyes lit on the peg from which dangled Nolly's new hat. A fur muff? She demanded, each word bristling with suspicion. At this time of year? It isn't a muff, Tanty Jan, said Nolly with a small voice. It is impossible to learn what it is. It's a hat, Tante Jans, Betty answered for her, a surprise from Mrs. Dan Diver. Wasn't it nice of— Oh, no! Nolly's hat has a brim, and a well-brought-up girl should. I know. I bought and paid for it myself. There were flames in Tante Jan's eyes, tears in Nolly's when Mamma came to the rescue. I'm not at all sure this cheese is fresh. She sniffed at the big pot of yellow cheese in the center of the table and pushed it across to Father. What do you think, Casper? Father, who was incapable of practicing deceit or even recognizing it, took a long and earnest sniff. I'm sure it's perfectly fine, my dear. Fresh as the day it came. Mr. Sturwick's cheese is always— Pause. Catching Mamma's look, he stared from her to Jan's in confusion. Jans, what do you think? Tante Jan seized the pot and glared into it with righteous zeal. If there was one subject which engaged her energies even more completely than modern clothing, it was spoiled food. At last, almost reluctantly it seemed to me, she approved the cheese, but the hat was forgotten. She had plunged into the sad story of an acquaintance, my very age, who had died after eating a questionable fish, when the shop people arrived and Father took down the heavy Bible from its shelf. There were only 2 employees in the watch shop in 1898, the clockman and Father's young apprentice, errand boy. When Mamma had poured their coffee, Father put on his rimless spectacles and began to read. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path. Thou art my hiding place and my shield. I hope in thy word. What kind of hiding place, I wondered idly as I watched Father's brown beard rise and fall with the words. What was there to hide from? It was a long, long psalm. Beside me and Nolly began to squirm. When at last Father closed the big volume, she, Willem, and Betsy were on their feet in an instant, snatching up their hats. Next minute they were raced down to the 5 stairs and out the alley door. More slowly the 2 shop workers got up and followed them down the stairs to the shop's rear entrance. Only then did the 5 adults notice me still seated at the table. Corey, cried Mom, have you forgotten your big girl now? Today, go to school. You go to school too, hurry, or you must cross the street alone. I'm not going. There was a short, startled silence, broken by everybody at once. When I was a girl, Tante Johns began. Mrs. Waller's children, from Tante Bet. But Father's deep voice drowned them out. Of course she's not going alone. Nolly was excited today and forgot to wait, that's all. Corey is going with me. And with that, he took my hat from its peg, wrapped my hand in his, and led me from the room. My hand in Father's. That meant the windwheel on the Sparran, or swans on the canal. But this time he was taking me where I didn't want to go. A railing along the bottom 5 steps. I grabbed it with my free hand and held on. Skilled watchmaker's fingers closed over mine and gently unwound them. Howling and struggling, I was led away from the world I knew into a bigger, stranger, harder one. Mondays, Father took the train to Amsterdam to get the time for the Naval Observatory. Now that I had started school, it was only in the summer that I could go with him. I would race downstairs to the shop, scrubbed, buttoned, pronounced passable by Betsy. Father would be giving last-minute instructions to the apprentice. Mrs. Stale will be in this morning to pick up her watch. This clock goes to the baker's in Bloemendale, and then we would be off to the station, hand in hand, I lengthening my strides and he shortening his to keep in step. The train trip to Amsterdam took only a half an hour, but it was a wonderful ride. First, the closed wedge buildings of the old Haarlem gave way to separate houses with little plots of land around them. The spaces between the houses grew wider, and then there were in the country the flat Dutch farmlands stretching to the horizon. Ruler straight canals sweeping past the window. At last, Amsterdam, even bigger than Haarlem, with its bewilderment of strange streets and canals. Father always arrived a couple of hours before the time signal in order to visit the wholesalers who supplied him with watches and parts. Many of these were Jews. and these were the visits we both liked best. After the brief if possible discussion of business, Father would draw out a small Bible from his traveling case. The wholesaler, whose beard would be even stronger and fuller than Father's, would snatch a book or a scroll out of a drawer, clap a prayer cap on his head, and the two of them would be off, arguing, comparing, interrupting, contradicting, reveling in each other's company. And then, just when I had decided that this time I had really been forgotten, the wholesaler would look up, catch sight of me, as though for the first time, and strike his forehead with the heel of his hand. A guest in my gates, and I have offered her no refreshment. And springing up, he would rummage under shelves and into cupboards, and before long I would be holding on my lap a plate of the most delicious treats in the world, honey cakes, date cakes, and a kind of confection of nuts, fruits, and sugar. Desserts were rare in the Beijing, sticky delights like these unknown. By 5 minutes before noon, we were always back at the train station, standing at a point on the platform from which we had a good view of the tower of the Naval Observatory. On the top of the tower, where it could be seen by all the ships in the harbor, was a tall shaft with 2 movable arms. At the stroke of 12 o'clock noon, each day the arms dropped. Father would stand at his vantage point on the platform, almost tiptoe with joy of the precision, holding his pocket watch and a pad and pencil. There, 4 seconds fast. Within an hour, the astronomical clock in the shop in Harlem would be accurate to the second. On the train trip home, we no longer gazed out the window. Instead, we talked about different things as the years passed. Betsy's graduation from secondary school in spite of the months missed with illness. Whether Willem, when he graduated, would get the scholarship that would let him go to university. Betsy started working as Father's bookkeeper in the shop. Oftentimes, I would use the trip home to bring up things that were troubling me, since anything I asked at home was promptly answered by the aunts. Once, I must have been 10 or 11, I asked Father about a poem we had read at school the winter before. One line had described a young man whose face was not shadowed by Saxon, and I had been far too shy to ask the teacher what it meant, and Mamma had blushed scarlet when I consulted her. In those days, just after the turn of the century, sex was never discussed, even at home. So the line had struck in my head. Sex, I was pretty sure, meant whether you were a boy or a girl, and sin made Tonty Johns very angry. But what the two together meant, sex sin, meant, I could not imagine. And so seated next to Father in the train compartment, I suddenly asked, Father, what is sex sin? He turned to look at me, as he always did when answering a question, but to my surprise, he said nothing. At last, he stood up, lifted his traveler's case from the rack over our heads, and he set it on the floor. Will you carry it off the train, Corey? He said. I stood up and tugged at it. It was crammed with watches and spare parts he had purchased that morning. It's too heavy, I said. Yes, he said, and it would be pretty poor. It would be a pretty poor father who would ask his little girl to carry such a load. It's the same way, Corey, with knowledge. Some knowledge is too heavy for children. When you are older and stronger, you can bear it. For now, you must trust me to carry it for you. And I was satisfied, more than satisfied, wonderfully at peace. There were answers to this and all my hard questions, for now I was content to leave them in my Father's keeping. Evenings at the Beijing, there was always company and music. Guests would bring their flutes or violins. Each, as a member of the family, sang or played an instrument. We made quite an orchestra gathered around the upright piano in Tonty Jan's front room. The only evenings when we did not make our own music was when there was a concert in town. We could not afford tickets, but there was a stage door at the side of the concert hall, through which sounds came clearly. There in the alley outside this door, we and scores of other Harlem music lovers followed every note. Mama and Betsy were not strong enough to stand so many hours, but some of us from the Beijing would be there in rain and snow and frost. and while from inside we could hear coughs and stirrings, there was never a rustle in the listeners at the door. Best of all was when there were concerts at the cathedral, because a relative was sexton there. Just inside his small private entrance, a wooden bench ran along the wall. Here we sat, our backs chilled by the ancient stone, our ears and hearts warmed by the music. The golden organ was one that Mozart had played, and some of its notes seemed to come from heaven itself. Indeed, I was sure that heaven was like St. Bavo's, and probably about the same size. Hell, I knew, was a hot place, so heaven must be this cold, dank, holy building where smoke rose like incense from the foot warmers of paying customers. In heaven, I fervently believed, everybody had foot warmers. Even in the summer, the chill never left the marble gray slabs of the floor, but when the organist touched the keys, we scarcely noticed, and when he played Bach, not at all. I was following Mama and Nolly up a dark, straight flight of stairs where cobwebs clutched at our hair and mice scurried away ahead of us. The building was less than a block from the Beijing, and probably a century newer, but there was no Tatiana to wax and scrub. We were going to see one of the many poor families in the neighborhood whom Mama had adopted. It never occurred to any of us children that we ourselves were poor. The poor were people you took baskets to. Mama was always cooking up nourishing broths and porridges for forgotten old men and pale young mothers, on days, that is, when she herself was strong enough to stand at the stove. The night before, a baby had died, and with a basket of her own fresh bread, Mama was making the prescribed call on the family. She toiled painfully up the railless stairs, stopping often for breath. At the top, a door opened into a single room that was obviously cooking, eating, and sleeping quarters all at once. There were already many visitors, most of them standing for lack of chairs. Mama went at once to the young mother, but I stood frozen on the threshold. Just to the right of the door, so still in the homemade crib, was the baby. It was strange that a society which hid the facts of sex from children made no effort to shield them from death. I stood staring at the tiny, unmoving form with my heart thudding strangely against my ribs. Nolly, always braver than I, stretched out her hand and touched the ivory white cheek. I longed to do it too, but hung back afraid. For a while, curiosity and terror struggled in me. At last, I put one finger on the small curled hand. It was cold. Cold as we walked back to the Beijing, cold as I washed for supper, cold even in the snug gas-lit dining room. Between me and each familiar face around the table crept those small icy fingers. For all Tanti Jans talked about it, death had been only a word. Now I knew that it could really happen. If to the baby, then to Mama, to Father, to Betsy. Still shivering with that cold, I followed Nolly up to our room and crept in bed beside her. At last we heard Father's footsteps winding up the stairs. It was the best moment in every day when he came up to tuck us in. We never fell asleep until he had arranged the blankets in his special way and laid his hand for a moment on each head. Then we tried not to move even a toe. But that night, he stepped through the door, and I burst into tears. "I need you," I sobbed. "You can't die. You can't." Beside me, on the bed, Nolly sat up. "We went to see Mrs. Hoog," she explained. "Corey didn't eat her supper or anything." Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. "Corey," he began gently, "when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket?" I sniffed a few times, considering this. "Why, just before we get on the train." "Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when you're going to need things too. Don't run out ahead of him, Corey. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you will look into your heart and find the strength you need, just in time. That is the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Carol. I first met Carol at one of the occasions for which Mama was famous. Afterward, I could never remember whether it was a birthday, a wedding anniversary, a new baby. Mama could make a party out of anything. Willem introduced him as a friend from Leiden, and he shook hands with us one by one. I took that long, strong hand, looked into those deep brown eyes, and fell irretrievably in love. As soon as everyone had coffee, I sat down just to gaze at him. He seemed quite unaware of me, but that was only natural. I was a child of 14, while he and Willem were already university men, sprouting straggly beards and breathing out cigar smoke with their conversation. It was enough, I felt, to be in the room with Carol. As far as being unnoticed, I was thoroughly used to that. Nolly was the one the boys noticed, though like so many pretty girls, she seemed not to care. When a boy asked for a lock of her hair, the standard method in those days of declaring passion, she would pull a few strands from the ancient gray carpet in our bedroom, tie them with a sentiment blue ribbon, and make me the messenger. The carpet was quite threadbare by now, the school full of broken hearts. I, on the other hand, fell in love with each boy in my class in turn in a kind of hopeless regular rhythm. But since I was not pretty and far too bashful to express my feelings, a whole generation of boys were growing up unaware of the girl in seat 32. Carol, though, I thought as I watched him spooning sugar into his cup, was different. I was going to love Carol forever. It was 2 years before I saw Carol again. That was the winter, 1908, that Nolly and I made the trip to university at Leiden to pay Willem a visit. Willem's sparsely furnished room was on the 4th floor of a private home. He gathered both Nolly and me into a bear hug and then ran to the window. "Here," he said, taking in from the seal a cream bun he had been keeping cold there. "I bought this for you. You better eat it quick before my starving friends arrive." We sat on the edge of Willem's bed, gulping down the precious bun. I suspected that to buy it, Willem had to go without lunch. A second later, the door slammed open, and in burst 4 of his friends, tall, deep-voiced young men in coats and twice-turned collars and threadbare cuffs. Among them was Carol. I swallowed the last bite of cream bun, wiped my hands on the back of my skirt, and stood up. Willem introduced Nolly and me around, but when he came to Carol interrupted. "We know each other already," he bowed, ever so slightly. "Do you remember? We met at a party in your home." I glanced from Carol to Nolly, but no, he was looking straight at me. My heart poured out a rapturous reply, but my mouth was still filled with the sticky remains of bun, and it never reached my lips. Soon the young men were seated at our feet on the floor, all talking eagerly and at once. Perched beside me on the bed, Nolly joined in as naturally as though visiting a university was an everyday event for us. For one thing, she looked the part. At 18, she was already in long skirts, while I was acutely cautious of the 6 inches of thick black schoolgirl stockings between the hem of my dress and the top of my shoes. Also, Nolly had things to talk about. The year before, she had started normal school. She didn't really want to be a teacher, but in those days universities didn't offer scholarships to girls, and normal schools were expensive. So she chatted easily and knowledgeably about things of interest to students. This new theory of relativity by a man named called Einstein, and whether Admiral Perry would really reach the North Pole. "And you, Corey? Will you go on to be a teacher too?" Sitting on the floor at my feet, Carol was smiling at me. I felt a blush rise beneath my high collar. "Next year, I mean," he persisted. "This is your final year in secondary school, isn't it?" "Yes. No. I stay home with Mama and Tatiana." It came out so short and flat. Why did I say so little when I wanted to say so much? That spring, I finished school and took over the work of the household. It had always been planned that I would do this, but now there was an added reason. Tanti Bep had tuberculosis. The disease was regarded as incurable. The only known treatment was rest at sanatorium, and that was only for the rich. And so for many months, Tanti Bep laid in her little closet of a room, coughing away her life. To keep down the risk of infection, only Tatiana went in or out. Around the clock, she nursed her older sister, many nights getting no sleep at all, and so the cooking and washing and cleaning for the family fell to me. I loved the work, and except for Tani Bep, I would have been completely happy. But over everything lay her shadow, not only the illness, but her whole disgruntled and disappointed life. Often I would catch a glimpse inside when I handed in a tray or Tatiana passed out one. There were the few pathetic mementos of 30 years in other people's homes, perfume bottles empty many years because well-bred families always gave the governess perfume for Christmas. Some faded daguerreotypes of children who by now must have children and grandchildren of their own. Then the door would shut. But I would linger in that narrow passage under the eaves, yearning to say something, to heal something, wanting to love her better. I spoke once about my feelings to Mama. She too was more and more often in bed, always before when pain from the gallstones had got her too bad. She had an operation, but a small stroke after the last one made further surgery impossible, and many days, making up a tray for Tanti Bep, I carried one upstairs to Mama also. This time, when I brought in her lunch, she was writing letters. When Mama wasn't supplying the neighborhood with caps and baby dresses from her flying needles, she was composing cheery messages for shut-ins all over Harlem. The fact that she herself had been shut in much of her life never seemed to occur to her. "Here's a poor man, Corey," she cried as I came in, "who's been cooped up in a single room for 3 years. Just think, shut away from the sky." I glanced out Mama's single window at the brick wall 3 feet away. "Mama," I said as I set the tray on the bed and sat down beside her, "can't we do something for Tanti Bep? I mean, isn't it sad that she has to spend her last days here when she hates it instead of where she's so happy? The Wallers or someplace?" Mama laid down her pen and looked at me. "Corey," she said at last, "Bep has been just as happy here with us, no more and no less than she was anywhere else." I stared at her, not understanding. "Do you know when she started praising the Wallers so highly?" Mama went on. "The day she left them. As long as she was there, she had nothing but complaints. The Wallers couldn't compare with the Van Hooks, where she'd been before. But at the Van Hooks, she'd eventually become miserable. Happiness isn't something that depends on our surroundings, Corey. It's something we make inside ourselves." Tanti Bep's death affected her sisters in characteristic fashion. Mama and Tatiana redoubled their cooking and sewing for the needy in the neighborhood, as though realizing how brief everyone's lifetime of service. Anyone's lifetime of service. As for Tanti John's, her own particular specter moved very close. "My own sister," she would explain at odd moments of the day. "Why, it might as well have been me." A year or so after Tanti Bep's death, a new doctor took over Dr. Blinkler's house calls. The new man's name was Jan van Veen, and with him came his young sister and nurse, Tin van Veen. With him also came a new gadget for taking blood pressure. We had no idea what this meant, but everyone in the household submitted to having a strip of cloth wrapped around his arm and air pumped into it. Tanti Johns, who loved medical paraphernalia of every kind, took a tremendous fancy to the new doctor, and from then on consulted him as often as her finances would permit. And so it was Dr. Van Veen, a couple of years later, who first discovered Tonty Johns had diabetes. In those days, this was a death sentence as surely as tuberculosis had been. For days the household was numb with the shock of it. After all these years of fearing even the idea, here was the dread of the thing itself. Tonty Johns went straight to bed on hearing the news. But inaction went poorly with her vigorous personality, and one morning, to everyone's surprise, she appeared for breakfast in the dining room precisely at 8:10, with the announcement that doctors were often wrong. All these tests and tubes, said Tonty Johns, who believed in them implicitly, what do they really prove? And from then on she threw herself more forcefully than ever into writing, speaking, forming clubs, and launching projects. Holland in 1914 was like the rest of Europe and was mobilizing for war, and the streets of Haarlem were suddenly filled with young men in uniform. From her windows overlooking the Bartelgerstraats, Tonty Johns watched them idly by, gazing aimlessly into the shop windows, most of them young, penniless, and lonesome, and she conceived the idea of a soldier center. It was a novel idea for its day, and Tonty Johns threw all the passion of her nature into it. The horse-drawn trolley on the Bartelgerstraat had recently been replaced with a big new electric one, but it still squealed to a stop, spitting sparks from rails and wire, when Tonty Johns stood imperiously before the Paget. She would sweep aboard, her long black skirts in one hand, and in the other a list of the well-to-do ladies who were about to become patronesses of the new venture. Only those of us who knew her best were aware, beneath all the activity of the monstrous fear which drove her on. And meanwhile her disease posed financial problems. Each week a fresh test had to be made to determine the sugar content of her blood, and this was a complicated and expensive process requiring either Dr. Van Veen or his sister to come to the house. At last, Ton Van Veen taught me to run the weekly tests myself. There were several steps involved, the most crucial being to heat the final compound to exactly the right temperature. It was hard to make the old coal-burning range in our dark kitchen do anything very precisely, but I finally learned how, and from then on, each Friday, mixed the chemicals and conducted the test myself. If the mixture remained clear when heated, all was well. It was only if it turned black that I was to notify Dr. Van Veen. It was that spring that Willem came home for his final holiday before ordination. He had graduated from the university 2 years before and was now in his last month of theological school. One warm evening during his visit, we were all sitting around the dining room table. Father, with 30 watches spread out before him, was marking in a little notebook in his precise, beautiful script, 2 seconds lost, 5 seconds gained, while Willem read aloud from the history of the Dutch Reformation. All at once, the bell in the alley rang. Outside the dining room window, a mirror faced the alley door so we could see who was there before going down to open it. I glanced into it and sprang up from the table. "Corey," said Betsy reprovingly, "your skirt." I could never remember that I was wearing long skirts now, and Betsy spent many evenings mending the rips I put in them when I moved too fast. Now I took all 5 steps in a bound, for at the door, a banquet of daffodils in her hands, was Ton Van Veen. Whether it was the soft spring night that put it in my mind, or Willem's dramatic pulpit-trained voice, I suddenly knew that the meeting of these two people had to be a very special moment. "For your mother, Corey," Ton said, holding out the flowers as I opened the door. "I hope she's—" No, you carry the flowers. You look beautiful with them." And without even taking her coat, I pushed the startled girl up the stairs ahead of me. I prodded her through the dining room door, almost treading on her heels to see Willem's reaction. I knew exactly how it would be. My life was lived just then in romantic novels. I borrowed them from the library in English, Dutch, and German, and often reading ones I liked in all 3 languages. And I had played this scene where hero meets heroine 1,000 times. Willem rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving Ton's. Father stood up too. Miss Van Veen, Father said with his old-fashioned manner. "Allow me to present to you our son, Willem. Willem, this is the young lady of whose talent and kindness you have heard us speak." I doubt if either one heard the introduction. They were staring at each other as though there were not another soul in the room or in the world. Willem and Tyne were married 2 months after his ordination. During all the weeks of getting ready, one thought stood out in my mind. Carol will be there. The wedding day dawned cool and sparkling. My eyes picked Carol immediately from the crowd in front of the church. Dressed in top hat and tails were all the male guests, but incomparably the handsomest there. As for me, I felt that the transformation had taken place since he had seen me last. The difference between my 21 years and his 26 was not, after all, as big as it once had been. But more than that, I felt, no, not beautiful. Even on such a romantic day as this, I could not persuade myself of that. I knew that my jaw was too square, my legs too long, my hands too large, but I earnestly believed, and all the books agreed, that I would look beautiful to the man who loved me. Betsy had done my hair that morning, laboring for an hour with the curling iron until it was piled high on my head. So far, for a wonder, it had stayed. She made my silk dress too, as she'd made one for each of the women in the family, working by lamplight in the evenings because the shop was open 6 days a week, and she would not sew on Sundays. Now looking around me, I decided that our homemade outfits were as stylish as any there. Nobody would guess, I thought, as the gentle press toward the door began, that Father had given up his cigars and Tanti John's, the coal fire, and her rooms in order to buy the silk that swished so elegantly with us now. "Corey?" In front of me stood Carol, tall black hat in his hands, his eyes searching my face as though he were not quite sure. "Yes, it's me," I said, laughing at him. "It's me, Carol, and it's you, and it's the moment I've been dreaming of." "But you're so grown up." "Forgive me, Corey, of course you are. It's just that I've always thought of you as a little girl with the enormous blue eyes." He stared at me a little longer and then added softly, "And now the little girl is a lady, and a lovely one." Suddenly the organ music swelling from the open door was for us. The arm he offered me was the moon, and my gloved hand resting upon it, the only thing that kept me from soaring right over the peaked rooftops of Harlem. It was a windy, rainy Friday morning in January when my eyes told me, at first, my brain refused to gasp, the liquid in the glass beaker on the kitchen stove was a muddy, sullen black. I leaned against the old wooden sink and shut my eyes. Please, God, let me have made a mistake. I went over in my mind the different steps, looked at the vials, the chemicals, the measuring spoons. No, all just the same as I have always done. It was this wretched room then. It was always dark in this little cupboard of a kitchen. With a pot holder, I snatched up the beaker and ran to the window in the dining room. Black, black as fear itself. Still clutching the beaker, I pounded down the 5 steps and through the rear door of the shop. Father, his jeweler's glass in his eye, was bent over the shoulder of the newest apprentice, deftly selecting the part for the array before them on the workbench. I looked through the glass in the door to the shop, but Betsy, behind her little cashier's desk, was talking to a customer. Not a customer, I corrected myself, a nuisance. I knew the woman. She came here for advice on watches, and then bought them at that new place, Cannes, across the street. Neither Father nor Betsy seemed to care that this was happening more and more. As the woman left, I burst through the door with the telltale beaker. "Betsy," I cried. "Oh, Betsy, it's black. How are we going to tell her? What are we going to do?" Betsy came swiftly from behind the desk and put her arms around me. Behind me, Father came into the shop. His eyes traveled from the beaker to Betsy to me. "And you did it exactly right, Corey? In every detail?" "I'm afraid so, Father." "And I'm sure of it, my dear, but We must have the doctor's verdict too. I'll take it at once." So I poured the ugly liquid into a small bottle and ran it over the slippery, rain-washed streets of Harlem. There was a new nurse at Dr. Van Ven's, and I spent a miserable, silent half-hour in the waiting room. At last his patient left, and Dr. Van Ven took the bottle into his laboratory. "There is no mistake, Corey," he said as he emerged. "Your aunt has 3 weeks at the very most." We held a family conference in the watch shop when I got back. Mama, Tantiana, Father, Betsy, and me. Nolly did not get home from her teaching job until evening. We agreed that Tanti Johns must know at once. "We will tell her together," Father decided. "Though I will speak the necessary words, and perhaps," he said, his face brightening, "perhaps she will take heart from all she has accomplished. She puts great store on accomplishment, Jans does, and who knows but that she is right." And so the little procession filed up the steps to Tanti John's room. "Come in," she called to Father's knock, and added, as she always did, "and close the door before I catch my death draughts." She was sitting at a round mahogany table working on yet another appeal for her Soldiers' Center. As she saw the number of people entering the room, she laid down her pen. She looked from one face to another until she came to mine and gave a little gasp of comprehension. This was Friday morning, and I had not yet come up with the results of the test. "My dear sister-in-law," Father began gently, "there is a joyous journey which each of God's children sooner or later sets out on, and Jans, some must go to their Father empty-handed, but you will run to him with hands full." "All your clubs," Tantiana ventured. "Your writings," Mama added. "The funds you've raised," said Betsy. "Your talks," I began. But our well-meant words were useless. In front of us the proud face crumbled. Tanti Johns put her hands over her eyes and began to cry. "Empty! Empty!" she choked at the last through her tears. "How can we bring anything to God? What does he care for our little tricks and trinkets?" And then, as we listened in disbelief, she lowered her hands and with tears still coursing down her face whispered, "Dear Jesus, I thank you that we must come with empty hands. I thank you that you have done all on the cross, and that all we need in life or death is to be sure of this." Mama threw her arms around her and they clung together, but I stood rooted to the spot, knowing that I had seen a mystery. It was Father's train ticket, given at the moment itself. With a flourish of her handkerchief and a forceful clearing of her nose, Tanti Johns let us know that the moment for sentiment had passed. "If I had a moment's privacy," she said, "I might get some work accomplished." She glanced at Father, and into those stern eyes crept the nearest thing to a twinkle I had ever seen. "Not that the work matters, Casper. Not that it matters at all." But she dismissed us crisply. "I'm not going to leave an untidy desk behind for someone else to clean up." It was 4 months after Tanti John's funeral that the long-awaited invitation came to Willem's first sermon. After less than a year as an assistant to the minister in Uditzen, he had been given a church of his own in Brabant, the beautiful rural southern part of Holland, and the Dutch Reformed Church. A minister's first sermon in his first church was the most solemn, joyous, emotional occasion, and an unemotional that an unemotional people could conceive. Family and friends would come from great distances and stay for days. From his own assistant pastorate, Carol wrote that he would be there and looked forward to seeing us all again. I endowed that word "all" with special meaning and pressed dresses and packed trunks in dirillum of anticipation. It was one of Mama's bad times. She huddled in the corner of our train compartment, the hand that grips Father's whitening at the knuckles each time the train lurked or swayed. But while the rest of us gazed out long rows of poplars in their bright June green. Mama's eyes never left the sky. What to us was a trip through the country, to her was a feast of clouds and light and infinite blue distances. Both the village of Maid and the congregation of William's church had declined in recent years, but the church building itself, dating back to better days, was large, and so Willem and Tyne's house across the street. Indeed, the Beige standards was enormous. For the first few nights, the ceiling seemed so far overhead that I could not sleep. Uncles and cousins and friends arrived each day, but no matter how many people moved in, the rooms always looked to me half empty. 3 days after we got there, I answered the front door knocker, and there stood Carol. Coal dust from the train trip still speckled his shoulders. He tossed his brown carpet bag past me into the hall, seized my hand, and drew me into the June sunshine. "It's a lovely day in the country, Corey," he cried. "Come walking." From then on, it seemed taken for granted that Carol and I would go walking each day. Each time we wandered a little farther down the country lanes that wound in every direction away from the village. The dirt beneath our feet so different from the brick streets of Harlem. It was hard to believe, at such moments, that the rest of Europe was locked in the bloodiest war in history. Even across the ocean, the madness seemed to be spreading. The papers said America would enter. Here in neutral Holland was one sunlit day follow after another. Only a few people like Willem insisted that the war was Holland's tragedy too. His first sermon was on this theme. Europe and the world were changing, he said. No matter which side won, a way of life was gone forever. I looked around at his congregation of sturdy villagers and farmers and saw that they did not care for such ideas. After the sermon, friends and more distant families started home, but Carol lingered on. Our walks lasted longer. Often we talked about Carol's future, and suddenly we were speaking not about what Carol was going to do, but about what we were going to do. We imagined that we had a huge old manse like this one to decorate, and rejoiced to discover that we had the same ideas about furniture, flowers, even the same favorite colors. Only about children did we disagree. Carol wanted 4, while I held out stubbornly for 6. And all this while, the word marriage was never spoken. One day when Carol was in the village, William came out of the kitchen, and with 2 cups of coffee in his hand, Tyne, with a cup of her own, was just behind him. "Corey," William said, handing me the coffee and speaking as though with effort, "has Carol led you to believe that he is serious?" Tyne finished his sentence for him. "Serious." The hateful blush that I could never control set my cheeks burning. Why? Willem's face reddened too, because, Corey, this is something that can never be. You don't know Carol's family. They've wanted one thing since he was a small child. They've sacrificed for it, planned for it, built their whole lives around it. Carol is to marry well, is the way I think they put it. The big barren parlor seemed suddenly emptier still, but what about what Carol wants? He's not a small child now. Willem fixed his sober, deep-set eyes on mine. He will do it, Corey. I don't say he wants it. To him, it's just a fact of life like any other. When we'd talk about girls we liked at the university, he'd always say at the end, of course I could never marry her. It would kill my mother. The hot coffee scalded my mouth, but I gulped it down and made my escape to the garden. I hated that gloomy old house, and sometimes I almost hated William for always seeing the dark, hard side of things. Here in the garden it was difficult. There wasn't a bush, hardly a flower, that Carol and I hadn't looked at together, that didn't have a bit of our own feeling for each other still clinging to it. Willem might know more than I did about theology and war and politics, but when it came to romance, things like
money, social prestige, family expectations. Why, in the books they vanish like rain clouds every time. Carol left Maid a week or so later, and his last words made my heart sore. Only months afterward did I remember how strangely he spoke them. The urgency, almost desperation in his voice. We were standing in the driveway of the manse, waiting for the horse and cart, which made still regarded as the only dependable conveyance when there was a train to be caught. We had said goodbye after breakfast, and if part of me was disappointed that he still not proposed, another part of me was content just to be beside him. Now suddenly in the driveway he seized both my hands. "Corey, write to me," he said, but not gaily, fleetingly. "Write to me about the Beijing. I want to know everything. I want every detail of that ugly, beautiful, crumbling old house. Write to me about your father, Corey. Write how he forgets to send the bills. Oh, Corey, it's the happiest home in Holland." So it was indeed, when Father, Mama, Betsy, Nolly, Tatiana, and I returned. It had always been a happy place, but now each little event seemed to glow because I could not share it with Carol. Every meal I cooked was an offering to him, each shining pot a poem, every sweep of the broom an act of love. His letters did not come as often as mine went singing to him, but I put this down to his work. The minister he was assisting, he had turned parish, calling over to him. It was a wealthy congregation, and large contributors expected frequent and unhurried visits from the clergy. As time went by, his letters came more seldom. I made up for it with mine, and went humming my way through the summer and fall. One glorious, nippy November day, when all of Holland was singing with me, the doorbell rang. I was washing the lunch dishes in the kitchen, but I ran through the dining room and down the steps before the rest of the family could stir. I flung open the alley door, and there was Carol. Beside him was a young woman. She stood smiling at me. I took in the hat with its sweeping feather, the ermine collar, the white gloved hand resting on his arm. Then a blur seemed to move over the scene, for Carol was saying, "Corey, I want you to meet my fiancé." I must have said something. I must have led them up to Tonty John's front room that we use now as a parlor. I only recall how my family came to the rescue, talking, shaking hands, taking coats, finding chairs, so that I would not have to do or say anything. Mama broke even her own record for making coffee. Tatiana passed cakes. Betsy engaged the young woman in a discussion of winter fashions, and Father pinned Carol in a corner with questions of the most international and impersonal nature. What did he make the news of that President Wilson was sending American troops to France? What did he make of the news that President Wilson was sending American troops to France? Somehow the half hour passed. Somehow I managed to shake her hand, then Carol's hand, and to wish them every happiness. Betsy took them to the door. Before it clicked shut, I was fleeing upstairs to my own room at the top of the house, where tears would come. How long I lay on my bed sobbing for the one love of my life, I do not know. Later, I heard Father's footsteps coming up the stairs. For a moment, I was a little girl again, waiting for him to tuck the blankets in tight. But this was a hurt that no blanket could shut out, and suddenly I was afraid of what Father would say. There'll be someone else soon, and that forever after this untruth would lie between us. For in some deep part of me I already knew there would not, soon or ever, be anyone else. The sweet cigar smell came into the room with Father, and of course he did not say the false, idle words. "Corey," he began instead, "do you know what hurts so very much? It's love. Love is the strongest force in the world, and when it is blocked, That means pain. There are two things we can do when this happens. We can kill the love so that it stops hurting. But then, of course, part of us dies too. Or Corey, we can ask God to open up another route for that love to travel. God loves Carol, even more than you do. And if you ask him, he will give you his love for this man, a love nothing can prevent, nothing destroy. Whenever we cannot love in the old human way, Corey, God can give us the perfect way. I did not know, as I listened to Father's footsteps winding back down the stairs, that he had given me more than the key to this hard moment. I did not know that he had put into my hands the secret that would open far darker rooms than this, places where there was not, on a human level, anything to love at all. I was still in kindergarten in these matters of love. My task then was to just give up my feeling for Carol without giving up the joy and wonder that had grown with it. And so, that very hour, lying there on my bed, I whispered the enormous prayer, Lord, I give you the way I feel about Carol, my thoughts about our future. Oh, you know, everything. Give me your way of seeing Carol instead. Help me to love him that way, that much. And even as I said the words, I fell asleep. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4. The Watch Shop. I was standing on a chair washing the big window in the dining room, waving now and then to a passerby in the alley, while in the kitchen, Mama peeled potatoes for lunch. It was 1918. The dreadful war was finally over. Even in the way people walked, you could see a new hope in the air. It wasn't like Mama, I thought, to let the water keep running that way. She never wasted anything. Corey, her voice was low, almost a whisper. Yes, Mama? Corey, she said. And then I heard the water spilling out of the sink onto the floor. I jumped down from the chair and ran into the kitchen. Mama stood with her hand on the faucet, staring strangely at me while the water splashed from the sink over her feet. What is it, Mama? I cried, reaching for the faucet. I pried her fingers loose, shut off the water, and drew her away from the puddle on the floor. Corey, she said again. Mama, you're ill. We've got to get you to bed. Corey. I put my arm beneath her shoulder and guided her through the dining room and up the stairs. At my cry, Tatiana came running down and caught in Mama's other arm. Together we got her onto the bed, and then I raced down to the shop for Father and Betsy. For an hour the four of us watched the effect of the cerebral hemorrhage spread slowly over her body. The paralysis seemed to affect her hands first, traveling from them along her arms, and then down to her legs. Dr. Van Veen, for whom the apprentice had gone running, could do no more than we. Mama's consciousness was the last thing to go, her eyes remaining open and alert, looking lovingly at each one of us, until very slowly they closed, and we were sure she was gone forever. Dr. Van Veen, however, said that this was only a coma, very deep, from which she could slip either into death or back to life. For 2 months, Mama lay unconscious on that bed, the 5 of us, with Nolly on the evening shift taking turns at her side. And then one morning, and unexpectedly, just as unexpectedly as the stroke had come, her eyes opened and she looked around her. Eventually, she regained the use of her arms and legs enough to be able to move about with assistance, though her hands would never again hold her crochet hook or knitting needles. We moved her out of the tiny room facing the brick wall down to Tonty Jan's front room, where she could watch the busy life of the Partella Jurastrat. Her mind, it was soon clear, was as active as ever, but the power of speech did not return, with the exception of 3 words. Mama could say yes, no, and perhaps because it was the last one she had pronounced, Corey. And so Mama called everybody Corey. To communicate, she and I invented a little game, something like 20 questions. Corey, she would say. What is it, Mama? You're thinking of someone? Yes. Someone in the family? No. Someone you saw on the street? Yes. Was it an old friend? Yes. A man? No. A woman Mama had known for a long time. Mama, I'll bet it's somebody's birthday. And then I would call out names until I heard her delighted, yes. Then I would write a little note saying that Mama had seen the person and wished her a happy birthday. At the close, I always put the pen in her stiffened fingers so she could sign it. An angular scrawl was all that was left of her beautiful curling signature, but it was soon recognized and loved all over Harlem. It was astonishing, really, the quality of life she was able to leave in that crippled body. And watching her during the 3 years of her paralysis, I made another discovery about love. Mama's love had always been the kind that acted itself out with soup pot and sewing basket. But now that these things were taken away, the love seemed as whole as before. She sat in her chair at the window and loved us. She loved the people she saw in the street and beyond. Her love took the city, the land of Holland, the world. And so I learned that love is larger than the walls we shut it in. More and more often, Nolly's conversation at the dinner table had been about a young fellow teacher at the school where she taught, Flip Van Worden. By the time Mr. Van Worden paid the formal call on Father, Father had rehearsed and polished this little speech of blessing a dozen times. The night before the wedding, as Betsy and I lifted her into bed, Mama suddenly burst into tears. With 20 questions, we discovered that no, she was not unhappy about the marriage. Yes, she liked Flip very much. It was that the solemn mother-daughter talk promised over the years for this night, the entire sex education which our taciturn society provided, was now not possible. In the end, that night, it was Tatiana who mounted the stairs to Nolly's room, eyes wide and cheeks aflame. Years before, Nolly had moved from our room at the top of the stairs down to Tanti Bep's little nook. And there she and Tatiana were closeted for the prescribed half hour. There could have been no one in Holland less informed about marriage than Tatiana, but this was a ritual, the older woman counseling the younger, one down through the centuries. One could no more have gotten married without it than one could have dispensed with the ring. Nolly was radiant the following day in her long white dress, but it was Mama I could not take my eyes off. Dressed in black as always, she was nevertheless suddenly young and girlish, eyes sparkling with joy at this greatest occasion the Ten Booms had ever held. Betsy and I took her into the church early, and I was sure that most of the Van Worden family and friends never dreamed that the gracious and smiling lady in the first pew could neither walk alone nor speak. It was not until Nolly and Flip came down the aisle together that I thought for the very first time of my own dreams of such a moment with Carol. I glanced at Betsy sitting so tall and lovingly on the other side of Mama. Betsy had always known that because of her health, she could not have children, and for that reason she decided long ago never to marry. Now, I was 27, Betsy in her mid-30s, and I knew that this was the way it was going to be. Betsy and I, the unmarried daughters living at home at the Beijing. It was a happy thought, not a sad one. And that was the moment when I knew for sure that God had accepted the faltering gift of my emotions made 4 years ago. For with the thought of Carol, all shining around love and thoughts of him had been since I was 14, came not the slightest trace of hurt. Bless Carol, Lord Jesus, I murmured under my breath, and bless her. Keep them close to one another and to you. And that was a prayer I knew for sure that could not have sprung unaided from Corrie ten Boom. But the great miracle of the day came later. To close the service, we had chosen Mama's favorite hymn, Fairest Lord Jesus. And now as I stood singing it, I heard behind me in the pew Mama's voice singing too. Word after word, verse after verse, she joined in. Mama, who could not speak 4 words, singing the beautiful lines without a stammer. Her voice, which had been so high and clear, was hoarse and cracked, but to me, it was the voice of an angel. All the way through she sang, while I stared straight ahead, not daring to turn around for fear of breaking the spell. When at last everyone sat down, Mama's eyes, Betsy's and mine, were brimming with tears. At first we hoped it was the beginning of Mama's recovery, but the words that she sung she was not able to say, nor did she ever sing again. It had been an isolated moment, a gift to us from God, His own very special wedding present. 4 weeks later, asleep with a smile on her lips, Mama slipped away from us forever. It was in late November that year that a common cold made a big difference. Betsy began to sniff and sneeze, and Father decided that she must not sit behind the cashier's table where the shop door let in the raw winter air. But Christmas was coming, the shop's busiest time. With Betsy bundled up in bed, I took to running down to the shop as often as I could wait on customers and wrap packages, and save Father clambering up and down from his tall workbench a dozen times an hour. Tatiana insisted she could cook and look after Betsy, and so I settled in behind Betsy's table, writing down sales and repair charges, recording cash spent for parts and supplies, and leafing through past records and growing disbelief. Well, there is no system here anywhere. No way to tell whether a bill has been paid or not, whether the price we were asking was too high or too low. No way, in fact, to tell if we were making money or losing it. I hurried down the street to the bookseller one wintry afternoon, bought a whole new set of ledgers, and started in to impose methods on madness. Many nights after the door was locked and the shutters closed, I sat on the flickering gaslight, poring over old inventories and wholesaler statements. Or I would question Father. How much did you charge Mr. Hoyk for that repair work last month? Father would look at me blankly. My dear, I can't really... It was Ben Huron, Father. An old one. You had to send it all the way to Switzerland for the parts, and here's the bill, and... His face lit up. Of course I remember. A beautiful watch, Corey. A joy to work on. Very old. Only he'd let dust get into it. A fine watch must be kept clean, my dear. Well, how much did you charge, Father? I developed a system of billing, and increasingly my columns of figures began to correspond to actual transactions. And increasingly, I discovered that I loved it. I had always felt happy in this little shop with the tiny voices and shelves of small shining faces, but now I discovered that I liked the business side of it too, like catalogs, stock listings, like the whole busy, energetic world of trade. Every now and then, when I remembered that Betsy's cold had settled in her chest and threatened, as hers always did, to turn into pneumonia, I would reproach myself for being anything but distressed at the present arrangement. And at night, when I would hear the hard, racking cough from a bedroom below, I would pray with all my heart for her to be better at once. And then, one evening, 2 days before Christmas, when I had closed up the shop for the night and was locking the hallway door, Betsy came bursting in from the alley with her arms full of flowers. Her eyes, when she saw me there, were like a guilty child's. For Christmas, Corey, she pleaded. We have to have flowers for Christmas. Betsy, tin boom, I exploded. How long has this been going on? No wonder you're not getting better. I stayed in bed most of the time, honestly. She stopped while great coughs shook her. I've only got up for really important things. I put her to bed and then prowled the rooms with new opened eyes, looking for Betsy's important things. How little I had really noticed about the house. Betsy had wrought changes everywhere. I marched back up to her room and confronted her with the evidence. What is important, Betsy? To rearrange all the dishes in the corner cupboard? She looked at me and her face went red. Yes, it was, she said defiantly. You just put them in any old way. And the door to Tonty John's room? Someone's been using paint remover on it and sandpaper too? That's hard work. But there's beautiful wood underneath. I just knew it. For years I've wanted to get that old varnish off. And see? Oh, Corey, she said, her voice suddenly small and contrite. I know it's horrid and selfish of me when you've had to be in the shop day after day. I will take better care of myself so you won't have to do it much longer. But oh, it's been so glorious being here all day, pretending I was in charge, planning what I'd do. And so it was out. We had divided the work backwards. It was astonishing, once we made the swap, how well everything went. The house had been cleaned under my care. Under Betsy's, it glowed. She saw beauty in wood, in pattern, in color, and helped us to see it too. The small food budget, which had barely survived my visits to the butcher and disappeared altogether at the bakery, stretched under Betsy's management to include all kinds of delicious things that had never been on our table before. "Just wait till you see what's for dessert this noon," she'd tell us at the breakfast table, and all morning in the shop this question would shimmer in the back of our minds. The soup kettle and the coffee pot on the back of the stove, which I never seemed to find time for, were simmering again. The first week Betsy took over, and soon a stream of postmen and police, derelict old men and shivering young errand boys were pausing inside our alley door to stamp their feet and cup their hands around hot mugs, just as they'd done when Mama was in charge. And meanwhile, in the shop, I was finding joy in work that I had never dreamed of. I soon knew that I wanted to do more than wait on customers and keep accounts. I wanted to learn watch repair itself. Father eagerly took on the job of teaching me. I eventually learned the moving and stationary parts, the chemistry of oils and solutions, tool and grind wheel and magnifying techniques. But Father's patience, his almost mystic rapport with the harmonies of watchworks, these were not things that could be taught. Wristwatches had become fashionable, and I enrolled in a school which specialized in this kind of work. 3 years after Mama's death, I became the first licensed woman watchmaker in Holland. And so it was established, the pattern our lives were to follow for over 20 years. When Father had put the Bible back on its shelf after breakfast, he and I would go down the stairs to the shop while Betsy stirred the soup pot and plotted magic with 3 potatoes and a pound of mutton. With my eye on income and outlay, the shop was doing better, and soon we were able to hire a sales lady to preside over the front room while Father and I worked in the back. There was a constant procession through this little back room. Sometimes it was a customer. Most often it was simply a visitor, from a laborer with wooden klompen on his feet to the fleet owner, all bringing their problems to Father. Quite unabashedly, in the sight of customers in the front room and with employees working with us, he would bow his head and pray for the answer. He prayed over the work, too. There weren't many repair problems he hadn't encountered, but occasionally one would come along that baffled even him. And then I would hear him say, "Lord, you turn the wheels of the galaxies. You know what makes the planet spin, and you know what makes this watch run." The specifics of the prayer were always different, for Father, who loved science, was an avid reader of a dozen university journals. Through the years, he took his stopwatches to the one who set the atoms dancing, or who keeps the great currents circling through the sea. The answers to these prayers seemed often to come in the middle of the night. Many mornings I would climb onto my stool to find the watch that we had left on 100 despairing pieces, fitted together and tinkering merrily. One thing in the shop I never learned to do as well as Betsy, and that was to care about each person who stepped through the door. Often when the customer entered, I would slip out into the rear door and up to Betsy in the kitchen. "Betsy, who is the woman with the Alpha label watch on a blue velvet van? Stout, around 50? "Oh, that's Miss Van Kugel. Her brother came back from Indonesia with malaria, and she's been nursing him. Corey," as I sped back down the stairs, "ask her about Miss Rinker's baby is. Ask her how Miss Rinker's baby is." And Miss Van Kegel, leaving the shop a few minutes later, would comment mistakenly to her husband, "That Corey ten Boom is just like her sister." Even before Tatiana's death in the late 1920s, the empty beds in the Beijing were beginning to fill up with a succession of foster children, who for over 10 years kept the old walls ringing with laughter, and Betsy busy letting down hymns and pant cuffs. And meanwhile, Willem and Nolly were having families. Willem and Tyne, 4 children. Nolly and Flip, 6. Willem had long since left the parish ministry, where his habit of speaking the hard truth had made a succession of congregations unhappy, and had started his nursing home in Hilversum, 30 miles from Haarlem. Nolly's family we saw more often, as their school, of which Flip was now principal, was right in Haarlem. It was a rare day when one or another of the 6 was not at the Beijing to visit Opa, at his workshop, or peer into Tonty Betsy's mixing bowl, or race up and down the winding steps with the foster children. Indeed, it was at the Beijing that we first discovered young Peter's musical gift. It happened around our radio. We had first heard about this modern wonder at a friend's house. A whole orchestra, we kept repeating to each other, somehow that seemed especially difficult to produce inside a box. We began to put pennies aside toward a radio of our own. Long before the sum was raised, Father came down with hepatitis that almost cost his life. During the long stay in the hospital, his beard turned snow white. The day he returned home, a week after his 70th birthday, a little committee paid us a visit. They represented shopkeepers, street sweepers, a factory owner, a canal bargeman, all people who had realized during Father's illness what he meant to them. They had pooled their resources and bought him a radio. It was a large table model with an ornate shell-shaped speaker, and it brought us many years of joy. Every Sunday, Betsy would scour the papers, British, French, and German, as well as our own, since the radio brought in stations from all over Europe and planned the week's programs of concerts and recitals. It was one Sunday afternoon while Nolly and her family were visiting that Peter suddenly spoke up in the middle of Brahms' Concerto. "It's funny they put a bad piano on the radio." "Shh," said Nolly. "But what do you mean, Peter?" asked Father. "One of the notes is wrong." The rest of us exchanged glances. What could an 8-year-old know? But Father led the boy to Tonty John's old upright. "Which note, Peter?" Peter struck the keys up the scale till he reached the B above the middle C. "This one," he said. And then everyone in the room heard it too. The B on the concert grand was flat. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting beside Peter on the piano bench, giving him simple musical quizzes, uncovering a phenomenal musical memory and perfect pitch. Peter became my music student until, in about 6 months, he had learned everything I knew and went on to more expert teachers. The radio brought another change to our lives, one that Father at first resisted. Every hour, over the BBC, we would hear the striking hours of Big Ben, and with his stopwatch in his hand, corrected to the astronomical clock in the shop, Father conceded that the first stroke of the English clock time after time coincided within the hour. Father remained, however, mistrustful of this English time. He knew several Englishmen, and they were invariably late. As soon as he was strong enough to travel by train again, he resumed his weekly trips to Amsterdam to get the Naval Observatory time. But as the months passed and Big Ben and the observatory continued in perfect agreement, he went less regularly. And finally, not at all. The astronomical clock, in any case, was so jarred and jaggled by the constant rattle of automobile traffic in the narrow street outside that it was no longer the precision instrument it had been. The ultimate ignominy came the day Father set the astronomical clock by the radio. In spite of this and other changes, life for the three of us, Father, Betsy, and me, stayed essentially the same. Our foster children grew up and went away to jobs and to marry, but they were often in the house for visits. The 100th anniversary came and went. The following day, Father and I were back at our workbenches as always. Even the people we passed on our daily walks were perfectly predictable. Though it was years since his last illness, Father still walked unsteadily, and I still went with him on his daily stroll through the downtown streets. We took our walks always at the same time, after the midday dinner, and before the shop reopened at 2, and always over the same route. And since other Harlemers were just as regular in their habits, we knew exactly whom we would meet. Many of those we nodded to were old friends or customers. Others we only knew from this daily encounter: the woman sweeping her steps on Koningsstraat, the man who read the world's shipping news at the trolley stop on the Groot Market, and our favorite, the man we called the Bulldog. This was not only because we never saw him without 2 large bulldogs on the end of a leash, but because, with his wrinkled, jolly face and short bow legs, he looked exactly like one of his pets. His obvious affection for the animals,
was what touched us. As they went along, he constantly muttered and fussed at them. Father and the bulldog always tipped their hats to one another ceremoniously as we passed. And while Harlem and the rest of Harlem strolled and bowed and swept its steps, the neighbor on our east geared for war. We knew what was happening. There was no way to keep from knowing. Often in the evening, turning the dial on the radio, we would pick up a voice from Germany. The voice did not talk or even shout. It screamed. Oddly, it was even-tempered Betsy who would react most strongly, hurtling from her chair and flinging herself at the radio to shut off the sound. And yet, in the interludes, we forgot. Or when Willem was visiting and would not let us forget, or when letters to the Jewish suppliers in Germany came back marked, address unknown. We still managed to believe that it was primarily a German problem. How long are they going to stand for it, we said. They won't put up with that man for long. Only once did the changes taking place in Germany reach inside the little shop at the Bartschillerstraat, and that was in the person of a young German watchmaker. Germans frequently came to work under Father for a while, for his reputation reached even beyond Holland. For when this tall, good-looking young man appeared with apprentice papers from a good firm in Berlin, Father hired him without hesitation. Otto told us proudly that he belonged to the Hitler Youth. Indeed, it was a puzzle to us why he had come to Holland, for he found nothing but fault with Dutch people and products. The world will see what Germans can do, he said often. His first morning at work, he came upstairs for coffee and Bible reading with the other employees, and after that he sat alone down in the shop. When we asked him why, he said that though he had not understood the Dutch words, he had seen that Father was reading from the Old Testament, which he informed us was the Jews' book of lies. I was shocked, but Father was only sorrowful. He had been taught wrong, he told me. By watching us, seeing that we love this book and are truthful people, he will realize his error. It was several weeks later that Betsy opened the door from the hallway and beckoned Father and me. Upstairs on Tonty John's tall mahogany chair sat the lady who ran the rooming house where Otto lived. Changing the bedsheets that morning, she said she had found something under his pillow, and she drew from her market satchel a knife with a curving 10-inch blade. Again, Father put the best interpretation on it. The boy is probably only frightened, alone in a strange country. He probably bought it to protect himself. It was true enough that Otto was alone. He spoke no Dutch, nor made any effort to learn, and besides Father, Betsy, and me, few people in this working class part of the city spoke German. We repeated our invitation to join us upstairs in the evenings, but whether he did not care for our choice of radio programs or because the evening ended as the morning began with prayer and Bible reading, he seldom did. In the end, Father did fire Otto, the first employee he had ever discharged in more than 60 years in business. It was not the knife or the anti-Semitism that finally brought it about, but Otto's treatment of the old clock mender, Christoffels. From the very first, I had been baffled by this brusquerie with the old man. It wasn't anything he did, nor in our presence anyway, but what he didn't do. No standing back to let the older man go first, no helping on with a coat, no picking up a dropping tool. It was hard to pin down. One Sunday when Father, Betsy, and I were having dinner at Hilversum, I commented on what I had concluded was simple thoughtlessness. Willem shook his head. "It's very deliberate," he said. "It's because Christoffels is old. The old have no value to the state. They're also harder to train in the new ways of thinking. Germany is systematically teaching disrespect for old age." We stared at him, trying to grasp such a concept. "Surely you're mistaken, Willem," Father said. "Otto is extremely courteous to me, unusually so. And I'm a good deal older than Christoffels. You're different. You're the boss. That's another part of the system, respect for authority. This is the old and the weak who are to be eliminated." We rode the train home in stunned silence, and we started watching Otto more closely. But how could we know? How in the Holland of 1939 could we have guessed that it was not in the shop where we would observe him, but in the streets and alleys outside, that Otto was subjecting Christophels to a very real small persecution? Accidental collisions and trippings, a shove, a heel ground into a toe, were making the old clocksman's journeys to and from work times of terror. The erect and shabby little old man was too proud to report any of this to us. It was not until the icy February morning that Christoffel stumbled into the dining room with a bleeding cheek and a torn coat that the truth came out. Even then, Christoffel said nothing, but running down to the street to pick up his hat, I encountered Otto, surrounded by an indignant little cluster of people who had seen what happened. Rounding the corner into the alley, the young man had deliberately forced the older one into the side of the building and ground his face against the rough bricks. Father tried to reason with Otto as he let him go, to show him why such behavior was wrong. Otto did not answer. In silence, he collected the few tools he had brought with him, and in silence left the shop. It was only at the door that he turned back to look at us, a look of the most utter contempt I have ever seen. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Invasion. The slender hands of the clock on the stairwell pointed to 9:25 as we left the dining room that night. That in itself was unusual in our orderly lives. Father was 80 years old now, and promptly at 8:45 each evening, an hour sooner than formerly, he would open the Bible, the signal for prayers, read one chapter, ask God's blessing on us through the night, and by 9:15 be climbing the stairs to his bedroom. Tonight, however, the Prime Minister was to address the nation at 9:30. One question ached through all of Holland like a long-held breath. Would there be war? We circled up the steps to Tonty John's rooms, and Father went to warm up the big table radio. We did not so often spend the evenings up here listening to music now. England, France, and Germany were at war. Their stations carried mostly war reports or code messages, and many frequencies were jammed. Even Dutch stations carried mostly war news, and that we could hear just as well on the small portable radio we kept now in the dining room, a gift from Pickwick the Christmas before. This, though, was to be a major broadcast. Somehow we all felt it merited the large old set with its elaborate speaker. We sat now, waiting for 9:30, tense and upright in the high-back wooden chairs, avoiding, as if at a kind of premonition, the cushioned and comfortable seats. Then the Prime Minister's voice was speaking to us, sonorous and soothing. There would be no war. He had had assurances from high sources on both sides. Holland's neutrality would be respected. It would be the Great War all over again. There was nothing to fear. Dutchmen were urged to remain calm until the voice stopped. Betsy and I looked up astonished. Father had snapped off the set, and his blue eyes were as a fire we had never seen before. "It is wrong to give people hope when there is no hope," he said. "It is wrong to base faith upon wishes. There will be war. The Germans will attack, and we will fall." He stamped out his cigar stub in the ashtray beside the radio, and with it seemed the anger too, for his voice grew gentle again. "Oh, my dears, I am sorry for all Dutchmen now who do not know the power of God. For we will be beaten, but he will not." He kissed us both good night, and in a moment we heard the steps of an old man climbing the stairs to bed. Betsy and I sat rooted to our chairs. Father, so skilled at finding good in every situation, so slow to believe evil. If Father saw war and defeat, then there was no other possibility at all. I sat bolt upright in my bed. "What is that?" There it was again. A brilliant flash, followed a second later by an explosion which shook the bed. I scrambled over the covers to the window and leaned out.
The patch of the sky above the chimney tops glowed orange-red. I felt for my bathrobe and thrust my arms through the sleeves as I whirled down the stairs. At Father's room, I pressed my ear against the door. Between bomb bursts, I heard the regular rhythm of his breathing. I dived down a few more steps and into Tonty Jan's rooms. Betsy had long since moved into Tonty Jan's little sleeping cubicle, where she could be nearer the kitchen and the doorbell. She was sitting up in bed. I groped toward her in the darkness, and we threw our arms around each other. Together we said it aloud. War. It was 5 hours after the Prime Minister's speech. How we clung together listening, I do not know. How long we did this, I do not know. The bombing seemed mostly to be coming from the direction of the airport. At last we tiptoed uncertainly out to Tony Jan's front room. The glowing sky lit the room with a strange brilliance. The chairs, the mahogany bookcase, the old upright piano, all pulsed with an eerie light. Betsy and I kneeled down by the piano bench. For what seemed hours we prayed for our country, for the dead and injured, tonight for the Queen, and then incredibly, Betsy began to pray for the Germans, up there in the plains, caught in the fist of the giant evil loose in Germany. I looked at my sister kneeling beside me in the light of burning Holland. "Oh, Lord," I whispered, "listen to Betsy, not me, because I cannot pray for those men at all." And it was then that I had the dream. It couldn't have been a real dream because I was not asleep. But a scene was suddenly and unreasonably in my mind. I saw the Groat Market, half a block away, as clearly as if I were standing there. I saw the town hall and St. Bavo's, the fish market, and its stair-step facade. Then, as I watched, a kind of odd old farm wagon, old-fashioned and out of place in the middle of a city, came lumbering across the square, pulled by 4 enormous black horses. To my surprise, I saw that I myself was sitting in the wagon, and Father too, and Betsy. There were many others, some strangers, some friends. I recognized Pickwick and Tews, Willem, and young Peter. Altogether, we were slowly being drawn across the square behind those horses. We couldn't get off the wagon. That was the terrible thing. It was taking us away, far away, I felt, but we didn't want to go. "Betsy," I cried, jumping up, pressing my hands to my eyes. "Betsy, I've had such a terrible, awful dream." I felt her arm around my shoulder. "We'll go down to the kitchen where the light won't show, and we'll make a pot of coffee." The booming of the bombs was less frequent and farther away as Betsy put on the water. Closer by was the wail of fire alarms and the beep of the house hose trucks. Over coffee, standing at the stove, I told Betsy what I had seen. "Am I imagining things because I'm frightened? But it wasn't like that. It was real. Oh, Betsy, what is a kind of vision?" Betsy's finger traced a pattern on the wooden sink worn smooth by generations of tin booms. "I don't know," she said softly. "But if God has shown us bad times ahead, it is enough for me that he knows about them. That's why he sometimes shows us things, you know, to tell us that this too is in his hands." For 5 days, Holland held out against the invader. We kept the shop open, not because anyone was interested in watches, but because people wanted to see Father. Some wanted him to pray for husbands and sons stationed at the borders of the country. Others, it seemed to me, came to see him sitting there behind his workbench, as he had for 60 years, and to hear in the ticking clocks a world of order and reason. I never opened my workbench at all, but joined Betsy making coffee and carrying it down. We brought down the portable radio too, and set it up in the display case. Radio was Harlem's eyes and ears, and very pulse rate, for after that first night, although we often heard planes overhead, the bombing never came so close again. The first morning over the radio came instructions that ground floor windows must be taped. Up and down the Bartelgerstraat, shop owners were out on the sidewalk. There was an unaccustomed neighborhood feel as if vice, rolls of adhesive, and tales of the night's terror passed from door to door. One store owner, an outspoken anti-Semite, was helping wail the Jewish furrier, put up boards where a painted glass had shaken loose. The optician next door to us, a silent, withdrawn individual, came over and taped the top of our display window where Betsy and I could not reach. A few nights later, the radio carried the news we dreaded. The Queen had left. I had not cried the night of the invasion, but I cried now, for our country was lost. In the morning, the radio announced tanks advancing over the border. And suddenly, all of Harlem was in the streets. Even Father, whose daily stroll was as predictable as his own clock chimes, broke his routine to go out walking at the unheard hour of 10 a.m. It was as though we wanted to face what was coming together, the whole city united, as though each would draw strength from each other. Hollander. And so the three of us walked, jostled by the crowd, over the bridge, on the Sparna, all the way to the great wild cherry tree whose blossoms each spring formed such a white glory that it was called the Bride of Harlem. A few faded petals clung now to the new leaf branches, but most of the bride's flowers had fallen, forming a wilted carpet beneath us. A window down the street flew open. "We've surrendered!" The procession in the street stopped short. Each told his neighbor what we had all heard for ourselves. A boy of maybe 15 turned to us with tears rolling down his cheeks. "I would have fought. I would have never given up." Father stooped down to pick up a small bruised petal from the brick pavement. Tenderly, he inserted it into his buttonhole. "That is good, my son," he told the youngster, "for Holland's battle has just begun." But during the first months of occupation, life was not so very unbearable. The hardest thing to get used to was the German uniform everywhere, German trucks and tanks in the street, German spoken in the shops. Soldiers frequently visited our store, for they were getting good wages and watches were among the first thing they bought. Toward us, they took a superior tone, as though we were not quite bright children, but among themselves, as I listened to them excitedly discussing their purchases, they seemed like young men, anywhere, off on a holiday. Most of them selected women's watches for mothers and sweethearts back home. Indeed, the shop never made so much money as during that first year of the war. With no new shipments coming in, people bought up everything we had in stock, even the Winkeldockers and the shop daughters. Merchandise that had been laying around so long it seemed part of the furniture. We even sold the green marble mantel clock and the twin brass cupids. The curfew, too, at first, was no hardship for us, since it was originally set at 10 p.m., long after we were indoors in any case. What we did object to were the identity cards each citizen was issued. These small folders contained photograph and fingerprints that had to be produced on demand. A soldier or a policeman, the Harlem police, were now under the direct control of the German commandant. Might stop a citizen at any time and ask to see his card. It had to be carried in a pouch about the neck. We were issued ration cards too, but at least that first year, the coupons represented food and merchandise actually available in the stores. Each week, the newspapers announced what the current coupons could be exchanged for. There was another hard thing it was hard to adjust to. Newspapers that no longer carried news. Long glowing reports of the successes of the German army on its various fronts. Eulogies of German leaders, denunciations of traitors and saboteurs, appeals for the unity of the Nordic peoples, but not news that we could trust. And so we depended again on the radio. Early in the occupation, Harlemers were ordered to turn in all private sets. Realizing it would look strange if our household produced none at all, we decided to turn in the portable and hide the larger. more powerful instrument in one of the many hollow spaces beneath the old twisting staircase. Both suggestions were Peter's. He was 16 at the time of the invasion and shared with the other Dutch teenagers the restless energy of anger and impotence. Peter installed the table radio beneath a curve in the stairs just above Father's room and expertly replaced the old boards while I carried the smaller one down to the big room Dresden department store where the radio collection was being made. The army clerk looked at me at the counter. "Is this the only radio you own?" "Yes." He consulted a list in front of him. "Tin Boom, Casper, Tin Boom, Elizabeth, at the same address. Do either of these own a radio?" I had known from childhood that the earth opened and the heavens rained fire upon liars, but I met his gaze. No. Only as I walked out of the building did I begin to tremble. Not because, for the first time in my life, I had told a conscious lie, but because it had been so dreadfully easy. But we had saved our radio. Every night, Betsy or I would remove the stair tread and crouch over the radio, the volume barely audible, while the other one thumped the piano in Tonty John's rooms as hard as she could to hear the news from England. At the first, the news over the radio and the news in our captive press was much the same. The German offensive was everywhere victorious. Month after month, the French-Dutch broadcasts could only urge us to wait, to have courage, to believe in the counter-offensive which must surely someday be mounted. The Germans had repaired the bomb damage to the airport and were using it now as a base for aid raids against England. Night after night we lay in bed listening to the growl of engines heading west. Occasionally English planes retaliated, and then the German fighters might intercept them right over Harlem. One night I tossed for an hour while dogs fight raged overhead, streaking my patch of sky with fire. At last I heard Betsy stirring in the kitchen and ran down to join her. She was making tea. She brought it into the dining room, where she had covered the windows with heavy black paper and set out the best cups. Somewhere in the night there was an explosion. The dishes in the cupboard rattled. For an hour we sipped our tea and talked until the sound of planes died away and the sky was silent. I said goodnight to Betsy at the door to Tonty John's rooms and groped my way back up the dark stairs to my own. The fiery light was gone from the sky. I felt for my bed. There was the pillow. Then, in the darkness, my hand closed over something hard. Sharp, too. I felt blood trickle along a finger. It was a jagged piece of metal, 10 inches long. "Betsy!" I raced down the stairs with the shrapnel shard in my hand. We went back to the dining room and stared at it in the light, while Betsy bandaged my hand. "On your pillow," she kept saying. "Betsy, if I hadn't heard you in the kitchen." But Betsy put her finger on my mouth. "Don't say it, Corey. There are no ifs in God's world, and no places that are safer than other places. The center of His will is our only safety. Oh, Corey, let us pray that we may always know it." The true horror of occupation came over us only slowly. During the first year of German rule, there were only minor attacks on Jews in Holland. A rock through the window of a Jewish-owned store, an ugly word scrawled on the wall of a synagogue. It was as though they were trying us, testing the temper of the country. How many Dutchmen would go along with them? And the answer, to our shame, was many. The National Socialist Bond, the quisling organization of Holland, grew larger and bolder with each month of occupation. Some joined the NSB simply for the benefits: more food, more clothing coupons, the best jobs, and housing. But others became NSBers out of conviction. Nazism was a disease to which the Dutch too were susceptible, and those with anti-Semitic bias fell sick of it first. On our daily walk, Father and I saw the symptoms spread. A sign in a shop window: Jews will not be served. At the entrance to a public park: no Jews. On the door of the library, in front of the restaurants, theaters, even the concert hall whose alley we knew so much better than its own seats. A synagogue burned down, and the fire trucks came, but only to keep the flames from spreading to the building on the other side. One noon, as Father and I followed our similar route, the sidewalks were bright with yellow stars sewn to coats and jacket fronts. Men, women, and children wore the six-pointed star with the word Jude, Jew, in the center. We were surprised, as we walked, how many of the people who we had passed each day, were Jews. The man who read the world shipping news in the Grove Market wore a star on his neatly pressed business suit. So did the bulldog, his jolly face more deeply lined than ever, his voice, as he fussed at his dogs, sharp and strained. Worse were the disappearances. A watch, repaired and ready, hanging on its hook in the back of the shop month after month. A house in Nolly's block mysteriously deserted. Grass growing in the rose garden. One day, Mr. Ken's shop up the street did not open. Father knocked on his door as we passed that noon to see if someone were ill, but there was no answer. The shop remained shuttered, the windows above dark and silent for several weeks. Then, although the shop stayed closed, an NSB family moved into the apartment above. We never knew whether these people had been spirited away by the Gestapo or gone into hiding before this could happen. Certainly, public arrests with no attempts to conceal what was happening were being more frequent. One day, as Father and I were returning from our walk, we found the Grove Market cordoned off by a double ring of police and soldiers. A truck was parked in front of the fish mart. Into the back were climbing men, women, and children, all wearing the yellow star. There was no reason we could see why this particular place at this particular time had been chosen. "Father, those poor people," I cried. The police line opened. The truck moved through. We watched till it turned the corner. "Those poor people," Father echoed. But to my surprise, I saw that he was looking at the soldiers, now forming into ranks to march away. I pity the poor Germans, Corey. They have touched the apple of God's eye. We talked often, Father, Betsy, and I, about what we would do if a chance came to help some of our Jewish friends. We knew what Willem had found hiding places at the beginning of the occupation for the German Jews who had been living in his house. Lately, he had also moved some of the younger Dutch Jews away from the nursing home. "Not my old people," he would say. "Surely they will not touch my old people." Willem had addresses. He knew of farms in rural areas where there were few occupying troops. Willem would be the one to ask. It was a drizzly November morning in 1941, a year and a half after the invasion, as I stepped outside to fold back the shutters, that I saw a group of 4 German soldiers coming down the Barteljorstrasse. They were wearing combat helmets low over their ears, rifles strapped to their shoulders. I shrank back in the doorway and watched. They were checking shop numbers as they walked. At Wiles Furrier's directly across the street, the group stopped. One of the soldiers unstrapped his gun and with the butt banged on the door. He was drawing it back for another blow when the door opened and all 4 pushed inside. I dashed back through the shop and up the dining room where Betsy was sitting, setting out 3 places. "Betsy, hurry! Something awful is happening to Wills." We reached the front door again in time to see Mr. Will backing out of his shop, the muzzle of a gun pressed against his stomach. When he had prodded Mr. Well a short way down the sidewalk, the soldier went back into the store and slammed the door. Not an arrest, then. Inside, we could hear glass breaking. Soldiers began carrying out armloads of furs. A crowd was gathering in spite of the early morning hour. Mr. Well had not moved from the spot on the sidewalk where the soldier had left him. A window over his head opened, and a small shower of clothes rained down on him. Pajamas, shirts, underwear. Slowly, mechanically, the old furrier stooped and began to gather up his clothing. Betsy and I ran across the street to help him. "Your wife," Betsy whispered urgently. "Where is Mrs. Well?" The man only blinked at her. "You must come inside," I said, snatching socks and handkerchiefs from the sidewalk. "Quick, with us." And we propelled the bewildered old man across to the beige. Father was in the dining room when we reached it and greeted Mr. Well without the slightest sign of surprise. His natural manner seemed to relax the furrier a bit. His wife, he said, was visiting a sister in Amsterdam. "We must find a telephone and warn her not to come home," Betsy said. Like most private telephones, ours had been disconnected early in the occupation. There were public phones at several places in the city, but of course messages went to a public reception center at the other end. Was it right to connect a family in Amsterdam with the trouble here? And if Mrs. Well could not come home, where was she to go? Where were the Wells to live? Certainly not with the sister where they could so easily be traced. Father and Betsy and I exchanged glances. Almost with a single breath, said, "Willem." Again, it was not the kind of matter that could be relayed through the public phone system. Someone had to go, and I was the obvious choice. Dutch trains were dirty and overcrowded under the occupation. The trip that should have taken under an hour took nearly 3. Willem was not there when I finally reached the big nursing home, just afternoon, but Tyne and their 22-year-old son Kik were. I told them what happened on the Betelgeuse and gave them the Amsterdam address. "Tell Mr. Well to be ready as soon as it's dark," Kik said. But it was nearly 9 p.m., the new curfew hour, before Kik rapped at the alley door. Tucking Mr. Well's clothing bundle underneath his arm, he led the man away into the night. It was more than 2 weeks before I saw Kik again to ask him what happened. He smiled at me, the broad, slow smile I had loved since he was a child. "If you're going to work with the underground, Tonty Corey, you must learn not to ask questions." That was all we ever learned of the Wells. But Kik's words went around and around in my head. The underground. If you're going to work with the underground. Was Kik working with this secret and illegal group? Was Willem? We knew, of course, that there was an underground in Harlem, or suspected it. Most cases of sabotage were not reported in our controlled press, but rumors abounded. A factory had been blown up. A train carrying political prisoners had been stopped, and 7 or 17 or 70 had made it away. The rumors tended to get more spectacular with each repetition, but always they featured things we believed were wrong in the sight of God. Stealing, lying, murder. Was this what God wanted in times like these? How could a Christian act when evil was in power? How should a Christian act when evil was in power? It was about a month after the raid on the fur shop that Father and I, on our usual walk, saw something so unusual that we both stopped in mid-stride. Walking toward us along the sidewalk, as so many hundreds of times before, came the bulldog with his rolling, short-legged gait. The bright yellow star had by now ceased to look extraordinary. So what? And then I knew what was wrong. The dogs. The dogs were not with him. He passed without seeming to see us. With one accord, Father and I turned around and walked after him. He turned a number of corners while we grew more and more
embarrassed at following him without any real excuse, although father and he had tipped their hats to each other for years. We had never spoken and did not even know his name. At last the man stopped in front of a small second-hand shop, took out a ring of keys, and let himself in. We looked through the window at the cluttered interior. Only a glance showed us that this was more than the usual hodgepodge of brick and brack, hollow-seated chairs. Someone who loved beautiful things had chosen everything here. "We must bring Betsy," I said. A little bell over the door jingled as we stepped in, astonishing to see the bulldog hatless and indoors, unlocking a cash drawer at the rear of the store. "Permit an introduction, sir," father began. "I am Caspar Ten Boom, and this is my daughter, Cornelia." The bulldog shook hands, and again I noticed the deep creases in the sagging cheeks. "Harry de Vries," he said. "Mr. de Vries, we've so often admired your affection for your bulldogs. We hope they are well." The squat little man stared from one of us to the other. Slowly, the heavy round eyes filled with tears. "Are they well?" he repeated. "I believe they are well. I hope they are well. They are dead." "Dead?" we said together. I put the medicine in their bowl with my own hands, and I petted them to sleep. My babies, my little ones, if you could only have seen them eat. I waited, till we had enough coupons for meat. They used to have meat all the time." We stared at him dumbly. I ventured at last, was it because of the rationing? With a gesture of his hands, the little man invited us into a small room in the back of the shop and gave us chairs. "Miss Ten Boom, I am a Jew. Who knows when they will come take me away? My wife, too, although she is a Gentile, is in danger because of her marriage." The bulldog raised his chin so high his jowls stretched taut. "It is not for ourselves we mind. We are Christians, Cato and I. When we die, we will see Jesus, and this is all that matters." But I said to Cato, "What about the dogs? If we are taken away, who will feed them? Who will remember their water and their walk? They will not wait, and we will not come, and they will not understand. No. This is my mind at ease. This way, my mind is at ease." "My dear friend," father grasped the bulldog's hand in both of his. "Now that these dear companions may no longer walk with you, will you not do my daughter and me the great honor of accompanying us?" But this the bulldog would not do. "It would put you in danger," he kept saying. He did, however, accept an invitation to come and visit us. After dark, he said. And so one evening the following week, Mr. de Vries came to the alley door of the Beige bringing his sweet, shy wife, Cato, and soon she and Harry were almost nightly visitors in Tonty John's front room. The bulldog's chief delight at the Beige, after talking with father, were the tombs of Jewish theology now housed in Tonty John's big mahogany case. For we had become a Christian some 40 years earlier without ceasing in the least to be a loyal Jew, a completed Jew, he would tell us, smiling, a follower of the one perfect Jew. The books belonged to the rabbi of Harlem. He had brought them to father more than a year ago, just in case I should not be able to care for them. Indefinitely. He had waved a bit apologetically at the procession of small boys behind him, each staggering under the weight of several huge volumes. My little hobby, book collecting. And yet, my old friends, books do not age as you and I do. They will speak still when we are gone, to generations we will never see. Yes, the books must survive. The rabbi had been one of the first to vanish from Harlem. How often it is a small, almost unconscious event that marks a turning point.
As arrests of Jews in the streets became more frequent, I had begun picking up and delivering work for our Jewish customers myself so they would not have to venture into the center of town. And so one evening in early spring of 1942, I was in the home of a doctor and his wife. They were a very old Dutch family. The portraits on the walls could have been a textbook of Holland's history. The Hemstras and I were talking about the things that were discussed whenever a group of people got together in those days. Rationing and the news from England. Then down the stairs piped a childish voice. "Daddy, you didn't tuck us in." Mr. Hemstra was on his feet in an instant. With an apology to his wife, he hurried upstairs, and in a minute we heard a game of hide-and-seek going on, and the drill of laughter of two children. That was all. Nothing had changed. Mrs. Hemstra continued with her recipe for stretching the tea ration with rose leaves, and yet everything was changed. For in that instant, reality broke through the numbness that had grown in me since the invasion. At any minute there might be a rap at this door. These children, this mother and father, might be ordered to the back of a truck. Dr. Hemstra came back to the living room, and conversation rattled on, but under the words a prayer was forming in my heart. Lord Jesus, I offer myself for your people, in any way, any place, any time. And then an extraordinary thing happened. Even as I prayed, that waking dream passed again before my eyes. I saw it again, those 4 black horses at the Groat Market. As I had on the night of the invasion, I scanned the passengers drawn so unwillingly behind them. Father, Betsy, Willem, myself, leaving Haarlem, leaving all that was sure and safe. Going where? End of chapter 5. Friends, brothers and sisters, the reason I bring this audio book to you and provide this is because I was led to by the Lord. Even though we live in a different time in a digital world, much of the same thing is beginning to unfold in our lives. It's a slow trickle. But you see, many of us see it has already begun. A type of occupation. I will be providing chapters 6 through 15 and as well as the closing chapter of the book very soon. I'm working on it now. I want you to remember something that the Lord told me during prayer as I read this book and the questions that came up. I asked Father, in this digital age, it's so much different than back then, like with the ration cards and telephones and the digital age, you know. How are you going to work? How are you going to do this now, this time that you've warned us about and prepared us for? He said, this is the time I prepared you for. So I asked, how are you going to work it with all of the digital technology they have? I heard in my heart, I will work in much the same way, just different methods. I pray you have the faith to stand and not be part of the crowd that turned their face against these people. This will be happening to both the Christians and the Jewish people. I believe it's the final war. In my heart, I believe it's the final war before the coming of our Father, that 4th kingdom with iron teeth in a digital world. We will not get through by our own strength or our own might, but by His Spirit, by the leading of the Holy Spirit. Our Father is Spirit, and we will worship Him in spirit and in truth. And we will go forward as true warriors of Christ, like He said in my dream, taking the keys of faith and love into row 3. I pray it blesses you. I pray you learn so much from it and take so much from it, just as I have. Lord bless you all until I come back on to provide the next chapter 6. I love you all. Lord bless you. Thank you for your love and prayers.